I'm Grace Kennedy. I'm a reporter at the Fraser Valley Current, and I've been there for a year and a couple months now, so almost the whole time that the Current's been around.
What made you want to work with them?
Well, I knew Tyler, and that was a big part of it. Tyler reached out to me kind of when he first had the idea for starting a newsletter, even before the Fraser Valley Current had gotten around, because we both worked for Black Press, him at the Abbotsford News, me at the Agassiz Harrison Observer. And I liked Tyler's work. And so, when I was on maternity leave, he was kind of talking to me about it. And then, when it got going, I applied. And
was that nerve-wracking at all to start to think about what it would look like in maybe a less traditional form of media, or was that exciting to you?
It was both, but I think for me, the nerve-wracking part wasn't that it was an untraditional form of media, because there are a lot of those out there that actually, they do really well, and you see that. And you see that's kind of the way that it's going with, if you're in the industry, you kind of see the direction where people are trying to take things. And so newsletters were definitely one of those ways. So it's like, obviously. And when Tyler said it was going to focus on long form journalism, that's what I love doing. Yeah. So it's like that part wasn't scary. The nerve-wracking part was the financial part of it, because it's like, well, it's brand new. What if it goes under and then I have no job and then I have no money? Yeah. But luckily, my husband has a very stable job. So I was, because if I was by myself, I probably would have been way more nervous about taking that step, even though it was a really great career step for me, like journalism wise and also mental health wise, just because when I was at Black Press, I was feeling very burnt out by just all the stuff that you have to do when you're a one-person newspaper. So I think overall it was really good, but I wouldn't have been able to do that if I was just a single journalist striking out.
Can you tell us more? Because it's sort of unique that the place that you were at has so many challenges to begin with, that it burns out journalists, that it's not really designed for journalists to reach their intellectual potential, to share their genuine thoughts and really elaborate on stories the same way it sounds like you get to in long-form journalism with the Current. Was there a particular motivation to want to be able to develop more on your viewpoints or more on a story than you were able to?
That's just what I like. I think every journalist has different things that they like to do. And like the Agassiz Harrison Observer, where I was, and the North Delta Reporter and the Cloverdale Reporter, where I were before, those are extremely small newsrooms that were kind of built for a different time. They were built to put out the weekly newspaper. And so you wrote stories throughout the week and you put the newspaper together and then you're done and you go on to the next week. But as things have changed over the years, you kind of added all these extra things, which are very important because that's how people consume news now. So adding the social media aspect to it, adding the online aspect to it. And then when you do stuff online, there's things like video and photos that weren't quite as prominent before. And so it all kind of gets piled onto one journalist. And there are certain people who can just do that and they love it and they love the busyness and the breaking news and the community features and getting to do it all the time. And I'm not necessarily one of those people. So I think that was part of it. It's just, it was just too much all the time for me. And I like to take things slower. I like to write many, many, many words about one thing. So that's kind of why long form is better for me.
Interesting. Do you think that is something we need more of in general? It feels like we get bombarded with so much information now that a thoughtful, well-articulated story seems to get kind of harmed, or it's harder for people to be able to follow through on. In the traditional sense, was that something that you got to experience in the beginning of your career, that there was more long form writing and then it tapered off? How did that sort of journey work?
Well, I'm still a baby journalist by by anyone's estimation. I haven't been in the industry very long. So, yeah, I guess, what's the best way? Was there more long-form journalism when I started? Not necessarily. I started kind of the way the industry is now, more or less. Like, obviously newsletters weren't a thing then, but sort of the mainstream media structure that people are very familiar with, that's the industry that I entered in, and that's what I went to school and kind of learned about. And when you're in school, there's tons of opportunities to try different things, maybe more so than you would get just, getting your first job right out of school. So it's like I did long form in university, and that's where I discovered that I really liked it.
Right.
And I think there is value in all sorts of different kinds of journalism. So it's a shame to me that a lot of companies seem to be chasing the same sort of journalism, because it does work for ad revenue. Like, it does, clicks are good if you're looking for a particular type of revenue. So people are pumping out a lot of stories, and doing it very quickly and not getting to do more of the long form stuff. But that doesn't mean that sort of journalism is bad necessarily, because we need, quick hits so that, there's a fire and you see it and you're like, my goodness, why is there a fire? And you can go and you can be like, this 200-word article succinctly explains why there's a fire and what happened, and you're good to go. But you also need long form journalism. You also need what I like to call, or what many people call fluff journalism, which I think is still very important, which is not necessarily investigative, not necessarily super important, but just stuff that is interesting for people to read and, makes them feel good after they've read it. So there's value for all those different kinds of journalism, that not every person is going to be good at all of them.
Yeah,
so.
My frustration, I guess, with the fluff journalism is it feels so much less. I've had a few of those pieces in other news organizations written about me, and it feels like it's missing, like they're just checking a box. And that's something I don't feel with the Current. When you talked about, I believe it was Jyoti that talked about the motorcyclist that came into town. That was a very long form article explaining and kind of bridging community divides, and maybe the people you didn't expect, or a story that you didn't see coming, kind of being shared. And I think uplifting the community, that you go, wow, I didn't even know these people existed, and here they are bringing the community together. Sometimes it feels like they're missing the point of the story.
Well, I guess to me, like Jyoti's Sick Motorcycle Club story, that to me, that wouldn't be a fluff journalism piece, because that was, that was an important, it was more of a community profile or a feature where it was talking about something of importance. They were coming to help these members of the community that had been, hurt by the landslide that went through Rockwell Drive, I believe it was. But so when I think of fluff journalism, I think of more where this hoof trimmer had reached out to us, and it's like, there's nothing important about a story about someone who trims cow hoofs for a living. Yeah. It's just fun.
Yeah.
And Jyoti had a similar story in the same series about an alpaca shearer.
Right.
And it's like those things, there isn't a huge significance to the story necessarily, but it's helps people get to know things that they wouldn't have thought about.
Yeah.
So I think there's like a very subtle, but I think important difference there. And like, yeah, as a journalist, it's kind of your job to look at the topic and be like, what kind of story is this? Really, like, is this something that has a deeper significance that I need to kind of dive into more? Or is this just a story about a bunch of alpacas getting a haircut, basically, which was an excellent story, by the way. That was Jyoti's. It was really good.
So can you tell us more about that? When you're thinking about a story, or when you're talking to a person, what is that process like in your mind to try and bring something to life? Is it that you go looking for all the stories? Do some of them just sort of pop up on your radar? What is sort of the process to develop a story?
This is so funny because this is the question that everyone asks journalists. How do you find your stories? Where do you get your ideas? And I feel bad that I don't remember who said this originally. It was a writer of some sort. And they basically said it's like everywhere there are millions of story ideas. You walk down the street and there are thousands of story ideas there. And the average person will see like one. A reasonable writer will see like a dozen, and a really good writer will see like 100 ideas. So I don't know where I am on that spectrum. I don't see tons of ideas every time I go for a walk necessarily, but that's part of it is you just, the stories that come from you internally are things that you're curious about or things that you notice. And then you're like, that's weird, or that's interesting, or that's different, or I want to know more about that. And then you kind of dig into it and you develop a story that way. And then when you're in a news organization, and I don't know how it works necessarily as a freelancer, I feel like that might be part of it more. If you're a freelancer, is kind of digging through your own ideas. But when you're working within a news organization, you also get people who email who are like, hey, I'm doing this cool thing, or I know of someone who's doing this, or you guys should really look into that, or things like that. And some of those are not great story ideas, but some of them are. And some of them are kind of not there yet. So you have to take their idea and be like, well, what is the actually like important or interesting part of this? And then some story ideas come from, you're at a family dinner and someone's like, I have a really important story for you. And sometimes it actually is a really important story. Sometimes it's not, but...
So there's, and I've said this before, but there's this idea in the Harry Potter series of the Golden Snitch. And yes. The role of the person is to go and chase it. Mm-hmm. And it's like paralleled to the idea of like your creative endeavor, the muse, the idea that you're not clear where you're going, but your interest, your curiosity is taking you somewhere. And you can't really predict where that's going to take you in the future. And so you just kind of chase it and hope for the best. Do you feel like with the current now, you're more free to chase stories that interest you personally? Has that changed at all?
For sure. Yeah. I don't think I've written a story that I haven't wanted to write for quite some time.
And what was it like previously?
Previously, you write stories that you have to write, as well as stories that you want to write. As a journalist, there's always opportunity to write stories that you want to write. But when there are a lot of other demands on your time, those opportunities are sometimes fewer and further between than maybe you would like. And it would take more effort to do the stories that you would want to. Because like at the Agassiz Harrison Observer, for example, when it's just you're writing something that you want to write, and then there's, notes on Facebook being like, oh my goodness, there's like 4 cop cars down here and a fire and this. And so you're like, okay, well, I guess I'm going to stop working on the thing that I wanted to work on, and I'll go, drive down to Harrison and see what's going on there and stuff. So, and some people love that. I'm not one of those people. Right. Some people that's what they want to do. And so they're just waiting for those calls. But for me, it's the getting to do more of the long form, digging into things, and sometimes just data entry is nice too. And I get to do some of that at the Current, which is good.
Right. So was it what you expected when you took the leap? What was the sort of genesis into moving in, getting started? Was it what you imagined? Was it better? How did you kind of approach those beginning phases? Oh gosh,
I don't even remember really, because I think it was kind of what I expected, but obviously not at the same time. I think it's always like that when you start a new job. You go in with your expectations, and some of them are met and some of them aren't. I think one of the things that was unexpected, that was hard for me at the beginning, was the level of in-depth editing that Tyler was doing on my pieces, because I had always worked at small newsrooms. So it was like me and one other person or just myself. So my stories never really got tons of editing. And then with Tyler, again, it was just me and Tyler. But because we had this different format, our stories went through a lot of editing. And so that was an adjustment because, and I think I have it pinned in my Twitter account, but it's like, I want to be a journalist, but I don't like conflict, confrontation, or criticism, which is not great for a journalist, but that's my own fault. But yeah, so it's like, I think going through that editing process was difficult for me at the beginning.
Right.
But it's like, it does make the stories so much better. And so you just have to get past that. And then when I started editing more of Tyler's stuff as well, it's kind of nice to give it back a little bit. Tyler's going to watch this and he's going to be like, that's why you're so rude. Because one time, one of his endings, I said, and I did not mean this rudely, but I said it anyways. I said, literally anything would be better than this, which is so rude and not what I meant necessarily. But and Tyler has said he's not as rude as I am sometimes, but it's that sort of stuff that our stories go through, is being like, this is quite weak. Perhaps we can figure out a way to make it better or whatever, and do suggestions on each other's stories and stuff. So that was hard to get used to at the beginning, but has really made our work so much better now.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Can you say more on that? Because
on me being rude to Tyler, or something else?
No, on the process of editing a story, because there's something wrong with what's going on perhaps in other newsrooms, where people are saying, I can't read this, where they feel so disconnected from the author, politically, in life experience, in values, in something where they say, I can't even read this newspaper anymore because I don't feel connected to it. And there's something about the editing process that makes it accessible to all people, if that's what the goal is. And talking to Tyler, talking to you, talking to Farhan, the goal is community, and not to separate or divide people, but to bring people together. I'm just interested in what that editing process is like, because people don't realize the process, the ending paragraph maybe went through 10 different edits to make it more accessible, maybe make it more optimistic, make it more like, we don't have the answer to this problem, and now you need to think about what we're going to do in the future. Like, what is that sort of editing journey like, and what is the end goal? What is the kind of guiding philosophy?
Well, like, it takes a lot of time. And so I think what you were saying about other newsrooms, I don't know if time plays into why some readers aren't feeling connected to those newspapers or those news organizations. But I know it's something that's in short supply across our industry. And the Fraser Valley Current is like really an exception to the rule because of our format. So, because like editing, it takes a lot of time, because it takes time to go out and interview people. And I know I take more time than some other journalists to like think about the interview afterwards and then write it out. And so you've written your story, and then best practice is that you edit it yourself first. I don't always do that. And so, but then you go through it again and you say, like, how can I make this better? Is this really what I want to say? And then for us, then it goes to like Tyler or Jyoti, and they give it a read. And then it just kind of depends on where the story's at, kind of what happens next. Because sometimes it's perfect and you're just doing like small line edits, like this word would be better if it was here. This word would be better if it was this word. This paragraph might be better underneath the following paragraph. But sometimes the edits are more substantial, where you read through it and you make 0 line edits because you're like, something about this needs to be totally reworked.
Right.
Or, there's obviously the in-between part where it's like you have questions, and so you leave comments being like, what about this? What about that? And then you have to go back and do more research and do more interviewing and stuff like that. Interesting.
So do you find that's really interesting that you say that you sit with the interview or the conversation you had with the person afterwards? What what are you doing during that time? Or how do you go about approaching those interviews? I'm just interested from my perspective of preparing for interviews with people, thinking about the research prior, thinking about how I'm going to kind of lay out, like people think that I just ask questions off the cuff, but I sort of have an idea of what the 2 to 3 hours is going to look like over time and what area I'm going to focus on in the first hour, second hour, and third hour. And so I'm just interested in what that kind of journey to develop a story is like when you're dealing with a human being, that like maybe you go into it and you think, I bet they're like this, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, this person's much different than I expected, and then you sit with this. What is that sort of journey to develop a story like?
Well, I think you just described it, right? You go in with your research ahead of time, and yeah, like you always go in with a list of questions, whether you have them written down in front of you or not. Like, you know what the point is for talking to this person. You're not just going to go up to a random person and start asking them random questions. That's not what journalists do, right? And then part of the challenge of journalism is that you do have to listen to people as they're talking. And so then it's thinking about what they've said at the end, and then, just sitting with that for a little bit, being like, does this line up with my ideas about the story before I went into this interview? And I'm thinking about this more for like people features. Because if you're doing something like, I'm working on a story right now about vertical farming. And so with that, those interviews weren't necessarily super unexpected. So with that one, my thinking afterwards is more like, how am I going to piece this all together in a story that logically makes sense and includes all the information that I need? But I also just yesterday, because I'm assuming this will come out much later, did an interview with Daryl Ralph, the ice cream man in Chilliwack. He's really lovely. And I saw the Chilliwack Progress just published an article about him as well. But
is that the person who bikes around back and forth on the Vetter Trail?
Yeah, I think so. He has a mobility scooter and his ice cream cart behind him. And so I did the interview with him, and I had more or less an idea of what the interview was going to be like. And some of those expectations were definitely confirmed. You know, he's doing it because it's enjoyable to interact with the kids, and he wanted to make people happy. No one goes into the ice cream business because, you know, if they don't want to make people happy, right? Yeah. But there were also some elements of our interview that were a little bit unexpected. So it's like, oh, how am I going to organize that in the story? Where is that going to fall? Is that my new lead? Or is that going to come later? Is that going to be the kicker? Like, how is that going to, I guess, work within the story? And then...
Sorry, lead and kicker. Oh. You're using industry terms. I'm interested.
Yeah, lead is just, you know, your first sentence of the story, or more roughly, like just the start of your story. Okay. The kicker is just the end.
Right.
So, and then the nut graph, which is a really weird word. That's like if you're in a breaking news story or whatever, or just a more traditional news story, that's your paragraph that's just like, this is what we're talking about, and here's why it's important. Like, this is the essence of the story, is the nut graph.
Right. So you have to think about that as you're talking to the person and sort of trying to reestablish where you're going to take the story, it sounds like.
In a way, but it's not
drastic.
Yeah, it's not drastic. It's not like I'm writing the story in my head as I'm talking to them. It's just, you know, you're talking to them for a purpose. The purpose is to write a story. So of course you're going to be thinking about how the things that they are saying are going to impact the story that you're writing. And sometimes it goes on like a totally different track, or the people are just like too interesting, and then you just listen. And then you have to really think about it afterwards and be like, okay, so that was not at all what I had planned. How will that work? And then those ones sometimes take longer, and sometimes in part because I put it off because I'm like, I don't totally know what to do now. And then you put it off and you're like, okay, now it's been like quite a while. I really need to write this story.
Right.
But yeah.
Can you tell us about some of the stories that you've written at the Current and what stood out to you? Tyler mentioned that you, the Japanese internment camp was a really interesting story to you, and it didn't get the love that maybe it deserved because the Fraser Valley flood started to happen sort of at the same time.
On the same day. I spent so long on this story, and then the same day that we publish it, everything went to,
So can you tell us, nascent stage, what were you thinking? How did the story get started? And what was the journey to bring it to life?
Oh, gosh. Feels like so long ago now. That's the problem with journalism, is that something that was like just a couple months ago is like ages ago. But then also some things that were actually ages ago feel like they just happened. It's a very weird industry.
I was actually going to ask about that as well, because you're always on the current thing. So a story doesn't, it falls into the background and you don't get to show it the love that maybe it deserves. Maybe it deserves to be in your mind, like the front page for a couple of weeks or something, in like a hypothetical world, but it only gets that one kind of big share.
Yeah, well, that's just how it works, right? Yeah, but like for the Tajmi internment camp story in particular, that one, I was aware of the internment camp, or rather the museum that was built there, from when I was at the Agassiz Harrison Observer. But it was a little outside my coverage zone. It was more in the Hope Standard coverage zone, so I never really got an opportunity to do a story on it. And I honestly don't remember what prompted me to want to do something on it then. Maybe there was an anniversary. Maybe I just came across it again. It's very unclear. Those are the sort of things that often you don't remember later, is what actually prompted it. But I went up and I did an interview with Ryan Ellen, who's the curator there, and he showed me around the internment camp. And at the time that I was writing that, I had no self-control, and I was doing 3 or 4 very in-depth stories all at the same time. So I'm like, why not do another one? And so one of the things that I really enjoy doing is adding historical elements to modern stories, especially if there's elements of history to it, like a museum or whatever. And one of the things that was at the museum at the time was the Broken Promises exhibit, where it looked at Japanese Canadian families, and it actually had itemized, families and an itemized list of the stuff that was taken from them, and, the value of that, and all these documents that were related to them being sent to internment camps. So, obviously tragic for all the Japanese Canadians that happened to. As a journalist, you're like, look at this wealth of information about this terrible time in our history. I wonder if there's someone from the Fraser Valley who went to Tajmi whose story that we could tell to kind of bring this internment camp to life. And I didn't find anyone particularly from the Fraser Valley. It doesn't mean they weren't there. It just means that, maybe they were harder to find or whatever. But there was a family who, and I should have reread the story because I forget their last name now. But there was a family from Vancouver who ended up going to Tajmi, and there was a lot of information about what happened to them, the stuff that they had. They had a gramophone player, they had a bunch of records, they had a kid's, ride on little toy or stuff, and all that stuff was itemized as being taken away. Husband was sent up to a work camp. Wife and kids were sent out to Hastings, and then they all were sent to Tajmi. I don't think this made it into the story, but the husband was brought back to Vancouver because one of the people he was working beside died, and so he accompanied the body back, and then he met up with his family at Hastings. I think it was the Nagoro family. That sounds very familiar. And so it was kind of just looking, into that family. And then the structure of the story just obviously came out of that, because you have this, family history that you want to tell. And there are a couple living descendants of that family that we did try and reach out to, but we weren't able to connect with for the story. And part of the other reason why I chose that family is because the Nikkei National Museum had some recordings of Taknagoro. That's right. He was one of the sons, and he became a broadcaster. And so he had done a lot of stuff and had talked about his family a lot. So it's like, perfect. Here are these records, from this person who was there, who can like help tell the story in a way. So the story went from modern day at the Tajmi Museum with Ryan and his, his efforts to kind of preserve this place and preserve this memory in the Sunshine Valley. And then going back to the Nagoro family and being like, this is what happened. Right. It was not great. And so, yeah, that story, I was really proud of it in the end, because it was like the type of story that I like to tell, where it's like important for people to know there's not necessarily like obviously there's a big problem associated with it, but it's not like there's something that people are able to do now. It's not like there's a big dam failure happening or whatever. But it's something that we need to know about so that we don't do it again, right? And it has, the personal elements and stuff like that as well. So
we hear the statement a lot, which is those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it.
Yes.
And one of the frustrations I have is that like around what's going on in the Ukraine right now, there are people who've experienced what's gone on in Ukraine in the Cold War. And it seems like we're bad at wanting to hear from those people. It seems like, broadly speaking, we have trouble wanting to hear from our elders right now, wanting to hear from senior populations about what happened in World War II, what happened during the Great Recession. We're entering a recession right now. It would be useful to understand how did they handle it? What was their mindset? What fiscal decisions did they make that we could learn from and try and apply to our own lives? Is that something you see or you obviously value people understanding history? And so I'm just interested to know where that comes from.
Well, I think in terms of people not necessarily wanting to talk to their elders, because it's difficult right now, because I believe that in society we are in a period of a lot of change, and a lot of that change is moving away from things that people have done in the past, like being racist, for example, which is good. I think we should not be racist. But there is a challenge when sometimes if you think of like boomers, for example, or older people and being like, oh, they're part of that problem that we're moving away from. And then you kind of forget. It's like, well, they also have very valuable experiences that we need to listen to and learn from as well. So I think that is a huge oversimplification, obviously. But that might be part of why you're feeling like people are, reticent to listen to the elders or learn from their elders, because we're trying to move forward. And if you feel like you're looking at the past, then you're not moving forward, right? But you're totally right, where there are tons of things that we should be learning from history. And sometimes it's just easier to learn from people who aren't here, if that makes sense. That shouldn't be the case, but it's like it's easier to learn from ancient history than from, your grandparents' history or your great-grandparents' history. And so I think that's part of it. And when you're talking about Ukraine, I did a story about Ukraine as well, and that's one that I actually was hoping I could bring up, because it has kind of a similar layout to the Tajmi internment camp story that I did, where I talked to this woman named Katya, whose last name I now no longer remember. I think it starts with a Z. And about her family. Her parents are in Kharkiv. And I haven't heard from her recently. I hope they're doing okay. And so it's talking about her and her experience with Ukraine and Russia. And then there's a huge Ukrainian immigrant population in the Fraser Valley. So it was trying to kind of connect that dot, or those dots rather, to be like, well, why, did people come to Canada in the past, and what was that experience like? So I looked into this one family who came from, I think it was the western side of Ukraine. They ended up in Abbotsford, moved to Aldergrove. And a lot of the reasons why they left were like a little bit parallel to some of what, modern Ukrainians are kind of experiencing today, because history does repeat itself, because it's so easy to forget, because 100 years ago is not a long time, but like memory wise, it's ancient history. It's I don't even, we don't even remember it. People don't even remember like stuff that happened in the 60s, right?
People barely remember the floods. Like that was not that long ago.
Yes. I think people want to forget the floods though.
So what did you learn from that story? And what are some of your broader takeaways when you do interviews on this history? Because as much as you're sharing information, there's so much more in your experience of writing the story and things you don't get to write about, or it could end up being a whole book. So what is it like to write stories, maybe particularly on those relationships with different cultures and communities and global events?
That's a good question. And usually it's bad when not usually, it feels bad when people say that's a good question, but usually it just means they're stalling for time and they need to think about it. But I think, there's always more to stories than ever gets to go in the article. And that's one of the, I think, frustrations of many journalists. It's like, I know so much now and I cannot tell you because there are not enough inches in this newspaper or, whatever the digital equivalent of that is. Yeah. And so I think as a journalist, it's nice. In a way, it's nice to be able to have that extra knowledge, because then you go into the next story knowing so much more, and then you're able to just more seamlessly integrate that knowledge so that other people can learn it. So I can't say, I haven't done another story about the conflict in Ukraine. It's still going on, so I'm wondering if we should. But I think kind of more about some of the stories that I've written about like the Indigenous people in the Fraser Valley. Because, growing up in Langley, didn't really know very much about it. I knew Kwantlen was over, on McMillan Island, basically. And that was more or less it. Because, I went to high school kind of definitely before BC kind of revised their curriculum to include more Indigenous elements, which I think is super great. But then working as a journalist, in North Delta and Cloverdale, kind of get exposed to it a little more in North Delta. I got to do a series on Indigenous education, which was really great. And kind of looking into why some Indigenous students were struggling more than their non-Indigenous counterparts, and getting to talk to Rhiannon Bennett, who is, I don't believe she is on school board anymore, but she was a really interesting, very passionate Delta school board trustee from Musqueam. And so she helped a lot, and I got to interview some other people at Finesc, and an elder who I think her name is Roberta Price, but now I cannot remember, so I don't want to say that for sure. But they kind of introduced me to Hunkaminam as a language and more about kind of the Musqueam people. And then when I went to the Agassiz, obviously there's like a lot of First Nations communities around Agassiz, Seabird, Stalis are the two that I covered most. And so I got to kind of experience more of that and get to learn more. And then at the Fraser Valley Current, we got to do different kinds of stories. And so it's like, as a journalist, it's really great because everything you learn isn't going to get into the story, but you just know more for next time. And you can write a better story next time.
Has being a journalist enriched your life? On the one hand, I feel like there's a certain school of thought where you learn about the darkest parts of our culture, of our history, of everything we've been through, and it can become really easy to kind of dismiss humans, to have kind of like there's always bad actors, there's always a negative element to a story, people are always mistreating other people. There's an easy kind of route people can take when they see our history and go, look at all the terrible people throughout history. But on the other hand, you can kind of help bridge divides, bring people back together, and make them look at history differently so we don't repeat it. And so I'm just curious, how has being a journalist impacted your maybe philosophy of the world? Because you do know so much more than the average person about waterways, about salmon, about the world around us, farms, and kind of how we're all a community, even when we don't have to think about it.
Well, at the very beginning of that question, you had said, has being a journalist enriched you? And it's like, well, no one goes into journalism for the money. So I think they probably go into it for the enrichment. But yeah, like, of course it changes your worldview. The same way as going to university kind of changes your perspective on things, or even just like living in society changes your perspective on things the longer you do it, because you learn more. And then the more things you learn, then you can be like, oh, this is like, yeah, I agree with this, or no, I agree with that, or I don't agree with that, or, there's, that sentence was not complete, but I will just go on to the next one.
That's good.
And I think what you're saying about, thinking about negative stuff and bad actors, that is definitely a huge part of journalism. And I'm so grateful at the Current that we don't have to focus just on that, because I know that was something that was very draining on me before, and it's part of the reason why I'm never going to be a breaking news journalist. Well, never say never, but I don't love it.
Yeah.
So, because it's so depressing. And people who do that every day, it's like, how do you do it? I don't understand. That is like quite the talent to be able to absorb all of that and still come out of it and like go to a pub and have a nice time. That's like, like people like Kim Bolin or Paul Henderson who focus on like crime and things like that as their main beat. That is like truly astonishing to me that they can, still be happy people at the end of the day. But, different strokes for different folks.
I don't know if I'm as optimistic that it doesn't impact them. I think that...
Oh, don't get me wrong. I'm sure it does. I'm sure it, the same way as being a paramedic is going to have a huge impact on you, or being a nurse. The stuff that you see every day is going to have a huge impact. But yeah, I think it's also partially the philosophy that you go into it with. I know Tyler is a little more cynical than I am about many things. And that's part of just like who we are.
Yeah.
I think, because like for me, I do ultimately and have ultimately believed that like most people are good. Most people are trying their best. The majority of people deserve the benefit of the doubt. And so that informs the type of journalism that I do and how I approach stories, which is sometimes good and sometimes bad. Right?
Yeah.
Just like every worldview is going to impact how you approach stories. That's why we need journalists from different backgrounds and different cultures and different economic statuses and all that sort of stuff.
Does that mix into your journalism at all, that you have a very positive maybe outlook on a story, and then there's a element that you're missing, maybe that it's more cynical, maybe it's more, I know people like to compare being a cynic to being like a realist, and they like to kind of overlap the two.
Oh, my husband's going to watch this and he's been like, you are not an optimist, because I'm not really an optimist, but I think my view on people is. But I think, if there is wrongdoing there, obviously you need to see that, right? I think it, not necessarily that it impacts how I tell. No, that's not what I want to say. I think it impacts the type of stories that I'm interested in writing.
Okay.
More so.
What's your favorite story to write? What's your favorite type?
Well, my favorite type of story is like kind of the stories that we've been talking about, where you get to take an in-depth look at something, you know. Science specifically, that's why I went to journalism school, because I wanted to work for National Geographic and I wanted to write science articles. Right. I am a little more modest in my ambitions now. But yeah, I like explaining things to people. So that's the sort of stories that I like to do. And I also discovered in university that I really like doing infographics and maps. So stories that I get to do those in, that's always a bonus as well.
When did you become interested in journalism? When did you start to think, were you reading National Geographic and saying, geez, this seems like a dream job? When did you start to be curious about that field?
Grade 9. But the story goes back to grade 7. I do have this as like a prepared story that I tell people. When did you want to be a journalist? It's like, well, in grade 7, I wanted to be a marine biologist because my dad started getting me National Geographics. And I was like, I'm going to study lemon sharks. And I had my whole plan. I was going to graduate high school. I was going to go to Dalhousie University. I was going to study marine biology. And then I was going to go and study lemon sharks. Wow. And that was my plan in grade 7. I had it all mapped out. I knew what some of the courses in my undergrad were going to be. And then I was reading National Geographic. And then in grade 9, I was reading a story on whales, and it had a description of the living situation for the marine biologists who were studying the humpback whales, and it didn't necessarily sound like my cup of tea. And so I was like, I see. And realistically, being a marine biologist would be fun, but I'm interested in too many things, I think, to have been able to tie myself down to one field like that. So I'm like, well, how can I still like be a marine biologist and learn about that stuff, but also have maybe a lifestyle that I am a little more comfortable with? It's like, I know, I'll work for National Geographic. I'll just write about it. And so that was my grade 9 plan, that I was going to work for National Geographic. But I think ultimately it was a good decision because I've always liked books. I've always liked writing. I've always been reasonably good at writing because I've done it so much and I've read so much. So I think that was like a natural fit for me. Right. So yes, that is my journalism origin story, is that it was fiscally prudent and in line with and then, as a grown-up, you're like, I could have picked so many other better paying fields, but that's okay. So
what was the journey to go, because you went to the East you went to King's University. Yeah. And what was sort of the philosophy once you got there? And were you thinking a lot about like the values of journalism, or what was that sort of early nascent stage at university like?
Well, at university, so the University of King's College is where I went. And they have a specific journalism program there. And I can't speak for all journalism schools, but I'm going to say I'm 99.7% sure that every journalism school has an ethics program that you have to take. Because the ethics of journalism is so important. Like you can't be a good journalist if you don't know what being a good journalist entails. It's slightly different than being a good person, if that makes sense. So it's like, yes, ultimately, if you're a journalist or if you want to be a journalist, make sure you have like reasonable morals before you go into the industry. But like being a good journalist is slightly different than being a good person. So that's why there's a course for that. So yeah, that's like part of it. And then it's also just ingrained into the sort of journalism that you're doing. They teach you at King's, and I'm sure at others as well, they teach you like, these are the concrete skills of journalism. Here's how to write, an inverted pyramid story. Here's how to, your eyebrows went up. So an inverted pyramid story is just your basic breaking news story. So you have your lead, which is who, what, when, where, why. And then you have your second paragraph, which is how, and then information that comes after that. The inverted pyramid story is built so that the most important information is at the top, and then you get to the less important information as you go down, with the idea being that in the olden days, a copy editor could just cut paragraphs off the bottom if it didn't fit in the spot for the newspaper, and you wouldn't miss anything important.
Wow. So is that culture at all changed within the Current, or is it the same logic?
We don't explicitly talk about inverted pyramid stories. Definitely in our longer form stories, we do not do that.
Right.
Because we're doing feature stories. Feature stories are never an inverted pyramid. Never is a strong word. Feature stories are almost never an inverted pyramid. But I think for people who are familiar with the Current, we have our agenda section that I think we do try and follow a little bit more of the traditional newspaper story style. So whether it's strictly inverted pyramid or whether it's just reminiscent of an inverted pyramid, hard to say. I haven't analyzed our stories recently for that, but yeah.
What is the design of the Fraser Valley Current from your perspective? Like when you get the newsletter, what do you, because I find, and I've said this like with Farhan and Tyler, I just find it so interesting, that beginning opening piece that's human.
Oh.
And then the journey kind of through what you need to know for the day. I find the whole product so accessible, and as Farhan kind of described, it's easier to get your news from there than really anywhere else.
Of course, Farhan would say that. It's our job. We do need to promote our paper. So yes, it is more accessible than anywhere else. Sorry, I shouldn't have moved away from the microphone. Yes, it is more accessible than anywhere else. But I think it's just a different style of news. And like that intro at the beginning, that's not every newsletter has that, but most do. I find
with a reporter talking about their life, because the one I've used as an example is your husband in trains.
Oh yeah, he does love trains.
Yeah.
Actually, him and my daughter were reading a train magazine this morning. It was pretty cute.
But that was so human. That's what stood out to me, was like, these are real people, and it's something I feel like other news organizations really forget, and then they'll make bold claims that really offset people and make information harder to digest, maybe is the right word, to like be able to consume, because it's like you think the person is their political perspectives rather than they're human beings. They've got interests, curiosities, they've got a life to live way beyond everything that's going on here. And it's why I like doing 2 to 3 hour interviews, is because we get to not just see a person for their accolades and their check marks and their resume, but we get to see them as a human being. And it's something I think the Current and OMG Media is doing a really good job of.
Well, and we definitely do that on purpose. Yeah. Like, one of the things that journalists really struggle with is like just horrible emails from people who in the period of fake news, but also before that, just kind of forget that we're people doing our jobs. Yeah. Right. And so I think that was something that Tyler kind of specifically included, whether Tyler specifically included or OMG specifically included, is like, if you do personalize that, we don't get a lot of really awful emails from people. Most people are very nice. Most people, if they have something a little bit more rude to say, sometimes they'll include an apology as well, being like, I understand that you're, working, or this is part of your job, but, and then they have whatever they're going to say, right? Yeah. And so I think that's why it's important for us. And I don't think it's just us. I think it's just very easy to see because it's part of our newsletter. Yeah. Because there was a shift probably right when I graduated high school, maybe a little bit after, where like Twitter was a big thing, still is a big thing for journalists, not a huge thing for, I think, the general population. It's kind of makes me laugh. It's just a lot of journalists and newsmakers talking to each other on Twitter, and academics, which is super helpful for me. But I think there was an idea when journalists were first getting on Twitter, is like, you can't share any of your personal information. You can't have any opinions. You're just like disseminating information. And then there was a shift, and I think Justin McElroy is a great example of this, where personalizing yourself on social media is actually a super valuable tool as a journalist. But then you do run into the problem of like creating your brand right? And it's more of a brand problem on social media than it is in our intros. But it is kind of similar, because then it's like, well, is this personal thing I'm going to share, does that fit with my brand? Is that something that I want tons and tons of people to know? Because yeah, like humanizing yourself for readers is really important. I think that's partially why Justin McElroy is so popular, because not only does he do great stuff, but he's very personable on a platform where it can be hard to feel personal connections with people. And so our intros do the same thing. But then I know for myself, I have a 2.5-year-old. I don't necessarily want to paint all of her exploits in the newsletter, right? Because she'll hate that when she's a teenager. So then it's like, well, what in my life do I feel comfortable sharing with approximately 25,000 people that I don't know in the Fraser Valley? Yeah. But you still want to share some things, and not everyone is going to. I know we had one reader who wrote in who she didn't really like that I was sharing stuff about my family. She's like, you just need to talk about the community more in your, just focus on the community. No one wants to hear about your kids and stuff. Wow. She didn't quite phrase it quite like that. Right. But then that's valid. Like, she's there for the news. She doesn't necessarily want to get to know us, and that's fair. And when I first got that email, I was like, I'm just going to write about my family just to spite her. But then, when you take a step back, you're like, no, actually, that's valid. Like, there needs to be a balance in kind of what we have in our intros. But it is tricky because, yeah, you want to be personable. You want people to kind of get to know you a little bit, but you also want to keep your private life a private life, right?
I think that's the danger, because I really like Substack and I find it very interesting, but I do think that we're going to have this challenge of audience capture, of people developing a perspective on something and then just hard committing to that topic and seeing, wow, this gets a lot of clicks, it gets a lot of views, it's getting a lot of traction, and so I'll just keep talking about that. And then they just kind of start to regurgitate and feed their audience the exact same thing they want to hear. And you do kind of become branded as the person who talks about X, and less a person who's dynamic and thinking about things and kind of elaborating on all the different ways you could look at a perspective and at an issue. And I think that is likely a challenge, but I think that there's a certain element of that that's so important, because I think that's where the faith in journalism is sort of changing. At what point in your university career, because I think journalists are as important as our doctors and those types of stuff.
Oh, shucks.
Yeah, because I think they're the stewards for the community. We can't and we shouldn't always trust our politicians to tell us what's going on or the facts, or be able to be completely transparent. Under some circumstances they can be, but under some circumstances they're not incentivized to. And so we can't 100% always trust their viewpoints. And that's where I think journalists tell us about everything that's going on in the best way they can. And so I think when we talk about community, I think they play a vital role in that. And I don't see anyone sort of filling the gaps in any other way. And so if you want to understand how your water's working, or what's going on in the river near you, or the mountains, or the political systems, or why is your school not getting repaired, there's a place you go to for that, and that's the journalism industry. Was there a point in time where you realized the importance of that mechanism in our society, or was that always on your radar? What was sort of the broader understanding of journalism as a function of our society?
That's a very good question. Because I'm not entirely sure that there was like a particular point. I always grew up, my dad always watched Global. So it'd be, you come home after school, and then when we have dinner, we'll have Global news on. Tony Parsons, and then when he retired and then moved to CBC, and then, Chris Galis after Tony Parsons, and so on. So like that part was always there. And, when Fukushima happened, for example, we had, the news on all day, right? And that's when you really, notice the 24-hour news cycle, because it's like there's nothing new. There's nothing new that you can say about Fukushima, but it's still playing.
Yeah.
So I think that part of it was always there, just kind of like in the background. It's like if you grow up being aware that a news organization is there, then obviously you're going to think that news has some value. And then in university as well, there, that's when it was really drilled into, like, this is a very important part of society. And then when you're in the industry, obviously, you're not doing it because you think you're not an important part of society. Like, I don't think there are a lot of jobs other than maybe some retail jobs, which is not the fault of the retail workers, but just the fault of the retail industry in general, where you or jobs where you just feel like you're a cog in a machine. But I think for the most part, most jobs are playing an important role in society. I was going to say something else, and now it has just left me. One of the things that I have worked on is trying to think of the role that all journalism plays and its value for society. Because in university, it's drilled into you that there is a particular type of journalism that is valuable to society. Or at least that's kind of what I found. It might not be true for everyone, but it's like breaking news is valuable for society. Investigations are valuable to society. And some other sorts of things are valuable for society. Political news is valuable for society, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But like what we were talking about earlier, fluff journalism is kind of seen as not valuable for society. And I disagree with that in part because that's what I like to write. But I think some of the problem that people have with journalism is because they do see it as very negative, and it's because there is sort of a value, like a value system in place where it's like breaking news, investigations, etc., are considered more valuable. And so you put more resources into it, and it is more valuable in the sense that that's what helps you solve problems, and solving problems is very important. But I think it's also valuable that people enjoy their life and get a chance to read things that are interesting to them or make them feel good. So I think like that's why it's important that we have well-funded news systems and news organizations, and that we have a lot of different journalists who can do a lot of different things, because all these things are important for very different reasons. So then if there's like, obviously I'm very biased, I'm a journalist, fund our work. But I think like the more, just the more opportunities there are for journalists to tell stories that interest them, the more valuable information we're going to learn about our society. And it doesn't have to be all problem solving or investigations or holding leaders to account, which are super important, but just like getting to know communities and people and industries better.
I couldn't agree more. It's one of those, like, it's easy to say we're going to hell in a handbasket. It's easy to do that and to just have a pessimistic view. And I think that that's really a huge currency in our culture right now, which is if you're very realistic, you're a very smart person if you think that everything's going to hell. Like, you're able to rest on, climate change or these issues, and it's easy to kind of get discouraged and think that you're insightful because you're discouraged. And I think there are people like Peter Ross who is working with First Nations communities, with local governments, to try and figure out what is the conditions of the Fraser River and how can we improve it, and what did the floods do to the Fraser River, and how can we all work together to try and improve that. And super inspirational person. And it was so meaningful to me that he wasn't discouraged, because he's the one who discovered that killer whales are some of the most contaminated mammals in the ocean. He's the person who was highlighting the fact that the Inuit, because they eat a lot of things from the ocean, have a lot of microplastics in them, because we're putting a lot of microplastics into the ocean from our polyester clothing. And to his own statement, we're wearing a lot more polyester. You wash polyester in your washing machine, millions of particles of microplastics are going into the ocean, like super dim finding. And to find out that polyester was done as a solution to try and address cotton problems and the amount of water that was going into that, it can feel disheartening to find these things out and go, wow, we tried to fix like recycling problems by bringing in the blue bin. And from his research, blue bins have not done that much in terms of improving circumstances. And then you find out someone from Canada tried to come up with that, and then it didn't work, and it's not having a big solution. But industry is using it as like, hey, we're green, we recycle. And things can look dim, but he still has optimism, because for every one step backwards, there's two steps forward. And there's that humility that he has to continue to want to help the world. And I think that's something that can get lost if you're just writing a piece on the problems, which is that the person behind it has nuance and has dedicated themselves to trying to address these issues. And I think that that's something you've done a good job of, and the Fraser Valley Current has, which is giving us like, here's your dose of the challenges, here are some of the good things going on, and this is life. You're going to have ups, downs, you're going to have people making a huge difference, and you're going to have people who are dumping things in the river or the ocean and causing problems. And to kind of remind people that things can be bad, but we can always be better. And that every day is like a tool to kind of rethink what we're doing and get involved in things. And I think that message is so much more inspirational than just telling people the facts of these are the 5 things where we're seeing problems kind of arising.
Yeah. Well, and like to anyone out there who's watching this and feels discouraged, that's a reasonable thing to feel. Things can be really discouraging, but you're totally right where, things are bad, but there are people who are working to make it better. And yeah, that Peter Ross, that's super interesting, right? The whole just everything about that. And I think there's a type of journalism that does try and address that. We don't do it explicitly at the Fraser Valley Current, but it's called solutions journalism, where you're talking about a problem, and then in the story you talk about the solution, right? And that's like a very specific type of story that is really gaining a lot of traction in a lot of different places. I think maybe the Narwhal or Hakai are doing kind of more solutions journalism, and my apologies if they're not. That's just kind of what came off the top of my head. But that's something that when I was going to school, advocacy journalism and solutions journalism were just sort of new or just being talked about in our program. And they were not seen as necessarily like good things, because for so many years, dating back to the 80s, really, the kind of the heyday of objective journalism. So you're supposed to be objective. You're not supposed to give your opinion. You're not supposed to necessarily come up with the solution, right? But I think we are kind of at a point in society where it's like we've spent so long being objective and just telling people the problem that, like, yeah, people are getting quite discouraged. And it can be really depressing. And so solutions journalism does kind of provide a counterpoint to that. Like, yes, it is depressing, but here is one thing that people are doing to make it better. And here's why it might work, or here are some of the challenges with it, or whatever.
Yeah. I think that's the challenge, is because you don't want people, like what's going on in the United States is people choose what they want to know, or what reinforces what they already think.
Oh, and it's so easy.
Yeah.
It's so easy to do that.
And I see a bit of it, I didn't know this, but I think it's the Globe and Mail and the National Post are philosophically on 2 different sides of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Not
left and right respectively. Yeah.
Yeah, and not extreme to the point where there's no facts left, which I would say is the danger within the United States with something like CNN and Fox, is that they're so far apart from each other that you're really not hearing the same story from either perspective. Mm-hmm. They both have different kind of conclusions at the end, and that's not a good sign. I think it's less so, but it is a danger, which is I see people only repost one news organization or the other and not have that balance. And it seems like with knowing people and talking to them, they don't repost a lot of post media, and they don't agree philosophically with most of the work they do in comparison to what I'm hearing about the Current, which is what gives me optimism, which is what gives me that optimism back, which is when I've sent out Fraser Valley Current articles, there's a sense of positivity, there's a pride in subscribing, there's people who are like, this is good information, or they enjoy the newsletter, and just having people like Farhan, yourself, and Tyler on, and having people go, I really like those people, like they're really interesting articles, and it's not always the same thing, and it's something reliable that I trust. It seems like, as I've said to Farhan and everyone, I feel like it's the solution because it's a bit of each piece that's necessary for people to understand what's going on in their community and take next steps, whatever the direction is, but also to just get back involved in the community. It's a word we use a lot, but my mother ended up doing the drum making as a consequence of having that put in community events that are upcoming. Cool. You just released one for August, which is all about the events that are going on. Returning after 2 years of a pandemic, returning back to the community and reconnecting seems really important. And it's something that you're able to highlight in a way that's more difficult if you have to read the newspaper every single day in order to understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm. I mean, ideally, you should be reading us every day. I jest, of course. But yeah, actually, that's something, it's kind of two different things, but I'll touch on the events one first, because that's something that we did a reader survey not too long ago. And that's something that apparently a lot of people mentioned, is that they wanted more events in there. So that's something that we're kind of trying to do more of, is offer more frequent readers of the Current will notice that our around town section has kind of expanded a little bit, which is where we post events. And so we're kind of trying to add a little bit more to that, because that's a need that people have seen. And that totally makes sense, because, it used to be that you had your events listing in the newspaper, and they still do that, but most people aren't going to the newspaper. They're going on Facebook, and Facebook algorithms are what they are. And so to kind of have a curated space where you can see kind of what's going on in your particular area, people are finding that important. So it's like, okay, that's a service that we can provide to people that doesn't really feel like a service because it's just events. Yeah. But it's like, oh, that's something that people think is important. And so, yeah, when you're building a community-based something, you have to think about what people want from it. As journalists, often you'll be like, well, they just want like good journalism, obviously, because that's what we do. But it's like, no, they want more from that. And so that's kind of the difference between doing journalism and then building a brand or building an organization, which is kind of what we're trying to do, is thinking about what people want and what they need and what they're saying. And then how can we do that in a way that makes sense for us and is valuable? And the other thing that I just wanted to go back to is you're saying how the Globe and Mail and the National Post being kind of like left and right, respectively, and people only looking at one. People forget that is how newspapers started. Like, the first newspapers were like super partisan rags. Like, that is 100% right. What the point was, is like, one was for the Tories and one was for the Grits, and you followed your Grit paper, you followed your Tory paper, and that's how it was for a really long time. And then it was only in like the mid 20th century, maybe like the yellow journalism of the 20s. Yellow journalism. I don't know enough about the history of journalism to be like, let me give you a definition of yellow journalism. But that's just kind of what journalism of the time was called. It was very salacious. It was very like kind of TMZ, if that helps at all. Yeah. And then you had the interwar period and the Depression and everything. And then you have World War II. And that's when you kind of start to get away from partisan journalism. And you get into the journalism that we think of today as being the pinnacle of journalism, this objective, this Walter Cronkite or Edward R. Murrow or whatever, the very like sedate sort of man talking into the microphone, somewhat like this. And then in the 80s was kind of like the height of that. But then when the internet came and money started kind of bleeding away from it, we are sort of going back to some journalistic roots. Not necessarily from the journalist perspective. People always think, oh, journalists are being told what to do from their superiors or whatever. And I really don't think that's the case. Like, I've heard of some stories like that, but for the most part, it's journalists doing journalism that they think is important. And the structures around them are the ones that are kind of leaning one way or another, depending on where, and that kind of shows like, you know, how they get their ad revenue, the type of companies that they're working with and things like that. So it's not necessarily a journalist thing like it was in the early 20th century and the late 19th century, but more of just like a organizational structure thing. Except for obviously your example in the States there with like Fox News and stuff, because that is definitely a throwback to like very early journalism.
Do you feel like there was a strong... We've gone through some very political things over the past couple of years.
That is a super understatement.
Yeah. So there's this disconnect between... I interviewed Clint Hames, past mayor Chilliwack. He had some very harsh comments about the trucker convoy. And I try not to have strong opinions on things because I think things are complicated. And oftentimes the people with the Canadian flags in their vehicle, I've seen them be like soccer moms. I've seen them be young people. I don't think that they're doing it maliciously. Like you, I think most people have good intentions, and if they have a strong position on an issue, that there is something there. Whether or not they're 110% correct and we can't disagree at all, there's something there they're trying to tell us.
There's something that's important to them about whatever issue, and they've, you know, and then the rest of it gets wrapped up in that. Yeah,
my fear is like, it's okay to say that like Stephen Harper was not the greatest prime minister, that he made a lot of mistakes. But with certain topics now, it feels more so that you have to condemn something like the truckers and say that how could they were wrong, or that like vaccines are the 110% the best thing that's ever been invented. Like it feels like we're more in a time where you have to have stronger positions on things. You can't go, yeah, there might be something there, I'm not an expert, and that's okay. It seems like we've been pushed away from that, and people have more Canadian flags and they're trying to make a more bold statement. And if you disagree with them, well, we're going to have to fight about it or something. Have you seen that increase? Or am I having a biased perspective on that? I'm just curious.
No, I don't think you're crazy, for sure. But I think it's because of the internet and social media. Because if you think about going to like a family gathering, for example, a place where you're likely going to meet people who have slightly differing political viewpoints than you. And there's also some value in not just like totally ripping them to shreds. It's like, of course, you're not going to, you know, go all hard out on your, you know, your anti-vaccine. Well, I won't say of course, but there is value in not going out on your anti-vaccine standpoint or your anti-freedom convoy standpoint or whatever, whatever it is, because there's some valuable connections that you want to maintain that are beyond just your opinions on those things. But I think as more people interact with more people in social media and online, or through op-eds, for example, then yeah, the only way that you're going to get, the only way that people are going to see you as believing in the thing that you believe in is if you believe in it wholeheartedly, unreservedly, with no, with nothing. And so as more people are interacting primarily online, and that's something you see with people who kind of get pulled into far right silos, kind of, and far left silos as well. Like, people kind of forget that that's another thing that happens.
Yeah.
But when you're kind of sucked into this very insular community and you only hear people who are kind of talking about the same thing, repeating the same thing, then yeah, you do have to agree wholeheartedly with that, because if you don't, then you're an outcast. And if those are your people, then, like, you don't want to be an outcast, right? No one, that people don't want that.
Yeah.
No one's ever wanted that in the history of, people, going back to like when humans and Neanderthals were getting together.
Yeah.
So,
do you feel like I feel like the Current is, again, a tool to kind of combat this, because so many different people can read this, and there is a community spirit that I feel like is strong. It's the bedrock of the product, and then the rest is discussing complex issues. Because I want to talk in a few minutes about the politics. We have municipal elections coming up in your kind of perspectives, but I want to understand, do you think that there's something fundamentally different about what the Current is doing in comparison to traditional sources that allows it to move away from this? I was very concerned about this during all of it. I get worried when people have such strong opinions that they want to shut down our highways, or when they think that there's no consequences to anything. Like, I get scared when both sides start to get stronger. And again, I talked to Farhan because I feel like this is a way to cool the temperature a bit, to say, okay, we hear this side, we hear that side, let's level this down, and let's just talk about community and what's going on. Because when you're on something like social media all the time, it's easy to feel like people are your enemies. There were so many people I saw say, if you believe this, you can just unfriend me now. And it's like, what a terrible path forward for our culture if you only have people you 100% agree with on your social media feeds. And it doesn't mean they're right, but again, I think there's usually an attempt to have merit to what they're trying to say, and social media allows you to think that person's wrong on this issue, so I don't need to talk to them anymore. And it's like, well, they might be 10,000% wrong on that issue, but they might be right about this issue, or they might be trying to connect community members in this other kind of unrelated way to their perspectives. Like, I think social media has pushed people to have perspectives on issues they never had to have previously, and so they're having opinions, and sometimes they're wrong, and they're not experts in political science or all these issues. And it feels like the Current just reminds people are farming alpacas, they are working with cows, they are trying to do these positive, normal day-to-day things.
We do like to remind people, well, I do like to remind people about cows. I'm definitely the resident cow person at the Current. But no.
Much needed for the amount of cows we have in this area.
Yes. There are 2 cows for every person in the District of Kent.
Wow.
That's a lot of cows.
Also, really quickly, isn't it like the Fraser Valley makes like 80% of the agriculture for BC or something like that? Somebody just said that to me recently, and it blew my mind.
mean, it sounds reasonable.
Yeah.
But I do remember reading that statistic, but I don't remember the number, so I can't be like, you're right. But yes, there is a statistic where the Fraser Valley does a lot of something relating to agriculture, for sure. Well, and initially when you were asking this question, you were saying, is the Fraser Valley Current combating, kind of divides between people, better than other news organizations, is kind of the roundabout way of what you were saying. And my initial reaction was like, well, no, like, everyone's doing their part. But thinking about it a little more, I think the thing that we are doing that's helpful is that we're new. Because that is one of the challenges of legacy media, is that it's been around for a long time and people have their built-in opinions, sometimes passed down from their parents or their grandparents, where it's like, we don't like Global because Global did this story about our Uncle Ned and it was wrong in 1979. And so we don't like Global. Or, CBC is so left-leaning or CBC is so right-leaning. And I think that's one thing as a news organization, is if you get people complaining that you are both leaning to the left and the right on the same story. I had that recently. It's like, okay, so I guess it kind of balances out in the end. Valid complaints on both sides, so works out well for me. But yeah, I think for the Current, because we're new, people don't have a totally set in opinion on us yet. And so you can bring people of different views together. And I think, like, if you're thinking about journalism organizations as being on a spectrum, we are definitely a little more to the left than to the right. And that's because of who Tyler is and who I am and who Jyoti is and Farhan and all the rest. It's like we have stories that we think are important to tell. And so we are more likely to appeal to readers who want to know those sorts of stories. So I think in a sense, it's like, yes, we're new. People are still figuring it out. We have definitely, with some of my coverage of Barry Neufeld, for example, we have definitely pushed away some people who would perhaps fall further to the right on the political spectrum.
Yeah.
So we are certainly not a perfect meeting ground for everyone, but no one's going to be, right? So I think like we do want to do that. We do want to be able to bring the Fraser Valley together, but by virtue of people and how people interact with stories now and how often people just don't want to interact with things that they don't agree with, it's never going to be perfect, right?
Yeah. Is one of the challenges that, like, perhaps typically conservatives or right-leaning people care more about finance, and that's a very difficult topic to cover in any meaningful sense because of the length, like how to, like right now we're seeing inflation, we're seeing information that's suggesting recession. It's difficult to explain that on a local level or come up with solutions that are going to appeal to a conservative community.
Well, I think, and just to clarify, when I was talking more right or left, I was thinking more like socially speaking. So people more on the right, the more like traditional family values sort of people, and people on the left, But I think from, like, if you're thinking more just about other stuff, like fiscal stuff or policy stuff or whatever, then yeah, I don't think that's difficult.
Okay.
It's just social stuff. It's like either you feel that people deserve to be treated equally, or you have views, or you don't. It's kind of my view on it. It's not super inclusive of people who don't, but it's like, yeah, either you feel like LGBTQ plus students deserve to be represented in schools, or you don't.
Yeah.
And so the people who don't, they're not going to find that some of the current stories really appeal to them.
Right.
But I think what you're talking about financially, Tyler is so good at that. Yeah. Like, so good at that. And so I'm learning from Tyler how to do that a little more. And I think that's one of the things that's fun about being in local news and having the time to focus on it, especially if you don't know stuff like budgets, very well, like I don't. That I think that's something kind of neat, is that you do get to take that deep dive into it, and you do get to kind of break it down. One of the most enjoyable and most memorable stories I did when I was at the North Delta Reporter was the Delta School Board budget from the first year that I was there. It was like my very first like lock-in. We went to the school board office, and it was me and Sandor from the Delta Optimist, and we just sat there and they told us their budget stuff and we asked questions, and I was super nervous because it was my first time doing it and I had no idea what I was supposed to ask. So I kind of just let Sandor do it all. Right. But then they explained the cuts and what the cuts would mean. And at that time, they had to cut some of their spending. So they were cutting EAs, and part of that was because they were anticipating that they would get fewer students with special needs that year. And so then I got to go back to the office and make an infographic, because that's what I like to do, and kind of explain to people, what this is going to mean for them, and why this is important, and why the school board has made this decision, and what the impacts are going to be for students, what the impacts are going to be for parents. And that's so valuable, but that takes a lot of time. So I think at the Current, that's something that's really great. And that's something that, like, obviously we were doing at the North Delta Reporter as well. That's something that all local papers try and do. It's just how much time you have to spend on it kind of depends, right? And one of the things that it's always difficult as a journalist to get compliments afterwards, because that's one thing that school board trustees complimented me on afterwards. They're like, we really like that infographic. We thought it laid out what was going on really well. And I was pleased with that. But it's also like, I don't know if you're supposed to like my story about your budget. Like, that feels wrong.
That's something interesting that I think you bring that's unique, which is this interest in sharing information in a way that's accessible for people. Obviously, writing is like all journalists share information, but making it, again, consumable for people. There is a culture, once people graduate university, that a certain portion of society is just not that intelligent and won't understand, no matter how many times. It's very common in law school to go, the general world will never understand this. We understand it. And so don't bother wasting your time trying to explain it to like a client. You'll just fix their problem for them because they don't understand. But it's something that I think such a really important example is when like our provincial apiculturist, Paul Van Westendorp, was willing to sit down and explain bees to people.
Yes, bees.
Like when people take that time and go like, most people don't know this, but it would be cool if they did. And like, we would be better off if they did. Again, Paul Ross being willing to break down what's going on in our oceans, what we can do as citizens, and really encourage people to take up that role and that responsibility, but not thinking they're more intelligent. And that passion for education seems like it's something really you enjoy, is saying like, this is something that's super weird that most people are never going to understand if we don't make it more accessible. And then that's where infographics come in. Can you tell us about that? When did that come up for you? And is it like a challenge? Like you go, this is very confusing. Can we make this readable? Like, where is the joy that comes from for making that for people?
It's a lot. Your questions are always fun because there are a lot of different questions in one. And sometimes you ask an earlier question and then a later question. I want to answer them both. So I think first is that like all journalists want to make things accessible. The question is, what skills do you have and in what way can you make it accessible? Video journalists make things accessible in a very different way than I can. And then some older journalists their way of making it accessible is just in their writing style, because that's what they've done through their career. And I'm really lucky that I got to go to journalism school in a time when online journalism was becoming important to educators, right? So Tara Tyre is one of the profs that I had in university, and she's really great. Hi, Tara, if you're watching. I feel like she might not, but I'll send this to her maybe. But she did a really great job of introducing like the importance of online and these really cool things that you can do online that you can't necessarily just do in print. And so there's this platform called JS, or this group called JS Night Lab, and they have really cool journalism resources that I love using. Because they are different interactive ways to make things more accessible. Like I did a story about frogs. And the province has all these audio recordings of what the frogs sound like when they're croaking. And so JS Night Lab has JS Night Lab sound site. And so you can embed the sound site into your story so that it will say the word, you click on the word, and then you'll hear the sound. And that's something we have fingers crossed, we have a Halkomelem language series coming up. So that's something that I'm really excited to use for that, because what better way to make that accessible to people than to see a word and to click on it and then to hear what it sounds like. Yeah. Right? And yeah, so I'm pretty sure it was Tara that introduced me to infographics, definitely to mapping. Pretty sure she taught me Google Fusion tables, which is now obsolete. Oh. But that was something that was like really fun to try out, because people like interactive things. That's why video games are popular and like phone games are popular and stuff. And there's some really cool stuff that you can do with it. And so it's just like, I feel very lucky that I got a chance to learn some of the basics of it so that I can test it out and see. And that's why it's always good to have like a team too. Because one of the things that we do at the Current is we do a lot of editing on our stories. We do a ton of editing on our infographics. Yeah, stories make sense. They're long. You got to pick the right words. You have to do the interviews and stuff. And then the infographics, we don't do quite as much editing on the words of infographics, but it's like, does this color work? Does this placement work? Is this the right graph to use? Is this the right animation to have with the graph? Should we be using a GIF? What can we use? Tyler loves GIFs. He jokes that he's going to do a university course on the importance of GIFs in journalism. But it's just different ways that you can show things to people. And so I think that's something that's really cool. And it does take a lot of time. Because like, I'm not a very mathy person. That's probably why I wouldn't have made a wonderful marine biologist. So it's like, we're looking at census data. I really like doing census stories. I really struggle with census stories because you have to like look at the math and look at the numbers and then come up with the story from that. So I don't know, that's a very roundabout way of doing it. But sort of one last thing to say on that is that because I'm not a very mathy person, sometimes it's just easier to make a graph. And then you're like, oh, I see the pattern now. I'm not very good at patterns. Right. So it's like, if there's a pattern in numbers, I won't see it. But if it's on the graph, then I'll be like, oh, obviously that's going down. Right. Or that's going up or whatever. So it's like, sometimes you just make it for yourself so that you kind of know what the story is. And then it's like, well, I've already made it. I might as well, put it in the story or whatever. And
then it adds context for those people who might have the same challenges you do.
Exactly.
Which is, I think, one of the broader challenges of journalism is that it's often print. And I think we have like a C- in literacy rates in Canada, something like a C or a C-.
Well, that's not ideal.
Yeah. I think that's why I sort of like podcasts, because there's way more people who can listen than can read. And it's a challenge for people to be able to figure out what's important and really digest it, where you can always rewind someone talking about it and re-listen to it and kind of go, oh, okay, that makes more sense. I've heard it a few times. I come from an oral tradition, so it interests me that podcasting exists and is a way of communicating ideas long form. And then it's super inspirational to me to think that there are these Indigenous stories that are long form that have like a narrative element that you could write it down, but how the beginning connects to the end might not be as clear. Again, I think people really like the Harry Potter series because the very beginning of the first movie connects with the very last of the last movie, but if you're not looking for sort of the patterns or the connections, you might miss it if you're reading it because you don't remember from the seventh book to the first book what happened. But if you can watch them, you can kind of see the overlaps or hear the overlaps of how they're kind of talking about things. Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. Like you're saying, different people learn in different ways. That's like a very
I want to say a very basic understanding of people. I'm not sure if, like, I've known that for as long as I can remember. That's been something that's been taught to me. It's like, you know, I'm a very visual learner in the sense that it's like, if I'm reading it, that's good. If there's a picture or a diagram, that's really helpful. You're obviously more of like an auditory learner, right? You know, with the oral tradition and with podcasts and everything.
Yeah.
And so I think with journalism, it's so important to try and use as many different things as you can to make things as accessible to as many people as you can. And so, yeah, that's why that's why CBC is actually really good for a lot of things, is because they have the web story. They have some really great journalists who do some really awesome infographics, and they have the television part of it, and they have the radio part of it. So it's like, even though there's limitations for some of the stories that they can do, it's like they have all those elements. So it's like almost guaranteed you can find a story in a format that's gonna work for you.
Yeah.
Right? Smaller organizations can't do that quite so much. Like, you know, Adam Louis is at the Agassiz Harrison Observer right now. I do not want him to, like, as one person, to go out and have to do all these stories that he has to put out for the Observer in all these different formats, just so that everyone can have an option.
Right.
But if you have the capacity to do that, then why not? Right?
So that's one thing. What has it been like to be a part of a team now? You were on your own.
It's so nice. Yeah, sorry, I cut you off. But yeah, it's so nice to be part of a team, because you kind of, and not that I wasn't with a team at the Agassiz Harrison Observer. It was different. Because Black Press works in kind of an unusual way, I suppose. And I haven't worked at any other news organization, so I can't say if it's similar for Post Media or CBC or wherever. But it's like you're at your own newspaper. So it's like at the Observer, I was, you know, responsible for figuring out all the stories and writing them. If I needed a second set of eyes, I could contact someone at the Progress, for example, and be like, hey, Paul, hey, you know, Greg, when he was there or whatever. This is a very complicated story, and I'm not confident in how I've written it or whatever. Do you want to take a peek at it? And then they can look at it and help out. So it's like, it's not like you're totally on your own, right? But there is a sense of, and also in the Agassiz Harrison Observer office, when I was there, we had a salesperson. We also had Tanya, who didn't work for the paper. She worked for Classifieds, which was supposed to be based out of Surrey, but she lived in Agassiz, so then she would work out of our office. And she was just like a great wealth of community information because she had lived in Agassiz for so long. So it's not like you're all by yourself. But working with a team of like-minded journalists is very different when you can all be focused on the same thing. And so that's been really nice. It's like, it's been nice to have Tyler and Jyoti and then Josh for our intern for the little bit that we had Josh, because then you have all these other people who are thinking about the same things that you're thinking about all the time, and like thinking about your stories and offering ideas and stuff. And that's why it's important to have diverse newsrooms too, because it's like, if we were all exactly the same, then it would just be like talking to yourself, kind of. So
can you put that into context? We had the floods. That's where a lot of people became aware of your team.
Yes.
But more recently, there was a shooting in Langley.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm just interested, what does that team dynamic look like during adversity, during a dark time in the community? How do you work collaboratively, and how would that be different than a regular office at Black Press?
I can't say exactly how it would be different than a regular office at Black Press, just because I never really had to cover any huge traumatic events when I was with Black Press. So it's hard for me to say exactly. I know at Black Press, it's like there's a province of reporters, right? Because Black Press papers kind of basically go from Surrey to Whitehorse. So, and there's some digital reporters that kind of float around. So it's like, if there's something big happening, then there are people who can assist you with that. And it's very similar at the Current. Poor Jyoti, she started on like November 15th, which was the first day of the like flooding and stuff. So she just like joined, and then it was like, okay, so like we'll onboard you later. Just like sit tight for a minute. But she was great because with the floods, it was very much, I was very grateful that I had Tyler on the team, because he's a really good like level-headed journalist in that. It's like he knows, one of the things that I struggle with is knowing what is important breaking news. And he knows what's important breaking news. So he was kind of taking the lead on like, oh shit, this is big, or this is not so big, or this is whatever. And then we were just following his lead and kind of his direction and working together in pumping out tons of stories. And like, one thing that we don't necessarily do super often is tag teaming stories. We tag teamed like almost every story for the first like week or so, for the floods. And then, yeah, so that was, I don't know, it's hard to say, because it's like when something like that happens, you just do it. You don't really think about it, because you can't think about it because there's no time to think about it. So you're just like operating on, I'm sure Tyler thought about it more because he was kind of heralding it. And as a reporter, I was more following his direction. And then as time went on, then it's like I was thinking my own story ideas and stuff like that. But in the beginning, it's just like you do what needs to be done to give people the information that they need at that moment.
So do you think it would have been harder if you were by yourself?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Because, just partially because like I am a younger journalist. So I wouldn't have all the kind of industry knowledge that Tyler had of like, what should one do in a disaster like this? I don't know if he's covered a disaster like that before. I feel like most people haven't. I feel like he probably hasn't. But it's just one of the things where like the more experience you have, the better you are at dealing with those sorts of situations. So
what was the response like in that particular situation? Because I got to see a lot of the tweets or the emails that you received that were like, we evacuated because of you. And it's still like a trip in my head to think again of that effect that journalism can have on families, on humans' lives. It's one of those things that makes me confident that journalism is one of those important industries that is comparable to that of a doctor or like police officers, where if you don't have that, people don't evacuate their homes, and then people lose everything and potentially their own lives if there isn't that response. And talking to Mayor Henry Braun and hearing him talk about how farmers couldn't kill their own animals, that they had to call in family members, and some of them didn't even have the chance to do that. Mm-hmm. And like, that is really heavy stuff to talk about, to think about. And the fact that things could have potentially been communicated earlier but weren't, and then there were vast consequences for people, and that can have an effect. What was that sort of like to come out of it and see the overwhelmingly positive response to your reporting?
That was weird. That was really weird. Just because as a journalist, you kind of like, you're throwing things out into the world that you think are important. And sometimes you get emails back from people. But like often you don't get emails back where it's like, this had a concrete impact on my life in this specific way. So that was very, I don't know if humbling is the right word. This feels like a very cliche word to use.
Surreal?
Yeah, I think surreal would be better, where it's just like, oh, yeah, I am actually like doing something that has tangible effects. You know, I'm not just like writing things and then maybe people will read them. It's like, no, people did read them. People did like leave their house early and then didn't have to, you know, evacuate last minute or whatever. And yeah, like totally, like you said, that's why journalism is important and valuable, and why local journalism is important and valuable as well, because one of the reasons why we were able to be, I guess, as valuable a news source as we were is because Tyler knew a lot about the valley and about the Nooksack already. I didn't know anything about the Nooksack, but Tyler had done interviews already about that for a story that he had planned to do a long time ago. And he knew a little bit more about the history. And so that's why it's important to have journalists who know the community, who are able to stay in the community. And that's something that journalism really struggles with, especially for smaller communities, especially for rural communities, which is a problem in disasters, right? Because usually it's a small paper. If you're a small paper, that means you're getting a new journalist like me, who's often by themselves. They're like flown in. This is their first journalism job, and they're just, living in their new community. And then eventually they're going to get a better paying job, because those jobs don't typically pay very well. And then they're going to leave, and it's going to be the next person who doesn't know anything. And that's kind of what happened at the Agassiz Harrison Observer for a while, is I was just a young person who would then go off and go somewhere else. And I was part of that cycle too. I was at the Observer for a year, went on mat leave, was there for a couple months, and then went to the Current, right? And so like that's a huge problem, because you need to have that sort of knowledge of the community and that background to know, to just, like we were talking about earlier, you just like, the more you know, the better your stories are.
Yeah.
Right? So
it's the same with policing, right? Because that's the argument for municipal policing, which is you don't want an officer who lives in Manitoba, finishing depot, and then ending up in northern Yukon, where they have no connection, no meaningful understanding of how things are done or that community culture.
Yeah. No, yeah. And I think that's totally true. Same argument for like rural doctors, I think, as well, where you get a connection with people and then if you leave, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know if there's a really good solution other than just like creating good, high, like well-paying jobs in rural communities for journalism, which is a challenge. It's a big challenge.
What was the shooting? I know it just happened recently, but that was also another hard to comprehend that took place kind of event. What was that process like?
Well, Tyler was on vacation, and I had just gotten off vacation. And like often, because Tyler has the most experience, I have like maybe 2 years more experience than Jyoti. And then obviously Josh, our intern, has the least experience out of all of us. So when Tyler was on vacation and Tyler and I were on vacation at the same time, right before, like the couple days before. So Jyoti was in charge. And then I got back, and it's not that I was in charge, like we're a team, but typically I would take a little bit more of the, like, let's take the lead on this role. But I didn't know that Tyler was still on vacation. So I assumed that Tyler was like on top of things. So I saw the shooting stuff in the morning. And actually my first thought was like, oh, thank God I don't work at Black Press. So I don't have to like go chase this right away. And then, got into the office, and Tyler had sent a message being like, hey, we should do some coverage on this so that we have it for the newsletter, because it could be something really big. At that time, all we knew was that some people had been shot. Who's to say if it was like, 2 people were shot and it's just sort of the same as what happened in the tragic homicide that happened in Chilliwack a couple days earlier. Too many homicides right now, not having it. Yeah. Or if it's going to be something bigger. And so I was chatting back and forth with Tyler, and he was being like kind of vague and not really making any decisions. And I'm like, why are you doing this? Like, you're supposed to be working, do your job and tell us what we're supposed to do. And then it clicked that he was still on vacation. So it's like, oh, okay. So then you just like make the decision and you're like, okay, well, I guess we're just going to write the story and follow through with it during the day. So that's just kind of what we did. Anyways, that's a very long-winded.
It sounds like Jyoti took the lead on that one, though. or was very involved?
We were all sort of involved in that. She definitely took the lead on social media, for sure. I was kind of doing the behind the scenes stuff because I was putting the newsletter together that day. So Jyoti and Josh were doing sort of just some of the background stuff that they needed to do for other things that we needed to do for the newsletter. And I was just watching the updates as they were happening. Because one of the challenging things for us is because the Fraser Valley is so large, it's impractical for us to, with such a small team, for someone to drive out to Langley, right? Because I'm here in Chilliwack. And so it's like, is it worth for me to drive an hour just to be in Langley so that if something happens, I can like be on the scene and get photos or whatever? At some place like the Langley Advanced Times, they're in Langley. Obviously, they're going to be on the scene. That's the important thing. And for a large organization like CBC or Global or CTV or whatever, they're going to send out their video journalists. That's what they do. So for us, it was more just like watching for press releases and watching for videos and stuff, and then just updating the story as that information came in. Right. So I did that during the day, and then because of my toddler, I'm usually off at 4. So then Jyoti took over for a little bit after 4, and then in the evening I went back on and did like a final update when I was finalizing some of the stuff for the newsletter. So for us, like it's not as dramatic as, this is one of the tough things about journalism, is like it wasn't as dramatic as it sounds. And when you're doing it, I find it's work. So it's like, obviously it's super tragic that Paul and Stephen were killed in that like gun shooting incident across like all these different areas. And it's also difficult that the suspect is dead, so they can't find out why, right? But you don't think about the like emotional side of it so much because you're just working. Yeah. You're just writing it out. You're just like, you're looking at the information, you're writing it out, and and then you're looking it over, being like, did I make any spelling mistakes? Did I get everyone's name right? And then clicking publish, and then getting a photo, and then socialing it, and doing this and doing that and doing the other thing. So, yeah, that's one of the reasons why I don't love that type of journalism, is because you don't get a chance to like feel very much because you're just working on it.
It's one of the aspects of being a journalist where your role is to disseminate information for people, and for a reader, we sort of get to process it. I think, to your point, I think a lot of people do just read it and go, oh, that sucks, and then move on with their day. Mm-hmm. But there is something going on in the valley right now where there is more violence. Like I just saw the Paul Henderson wrote the story on what happened in Yarrow with the gas station owner now. I imagine that those kids are imperfect and they're young people and they're likely causing shenanigans and having a good day. But then the owner or someone related to the ownership of the Petro-Canada goes outside and like beats them with half a shovel or something. And then they have to go to the hospital. Like when I read that, it was really heavy because, and I mentioned this to Tyler, like we know that the heat has a huge impact on people in a way that cold has like a different impact on people. And I saw that, from my understanding, Surrey is allowing all public pools to be open to the public, no charge. I don't think we're doing that in Chilliwack. No. And I think it's alarming to me because from what I've seen, we've got 2 air conditioners running in our home right now, but at Home Depot, they don't allow you to pre-order or save like an order to have it shipped to you. And then on Best Buy, they're more expensive but claiming to be on sale. So the one that we found was like $650, and then on Best Buy it was like $1,500, regular price $1,700. It was the exact same air conditioner. And so my concern is that we don't prioritize getting people air conditioners the same way we prioritize them having warming centers in the winter, and that there's some sort of disconnect taking place there. And people don't, like working as a native court worker, I get to see people come in and have court matters after a really hot weekend, and seeing that, like, yeah, we can put the blame on you for misbehaving, drinking alcohol, and then having the sun beating down on you. But a certain amount of that is, it's 40 degrees, it's 35 degrees, and sleeping in a room with air conditioning is such a different experience because your temperature is regulated. But for the few days where we had our home flooded and we had to move, those nights where it was hot, it was hard for us to sleep because we were so used to having temperature controlled rooms. And then there's a whole community of disadvantaged people who are just getting by on, like, they have a couple of $100 extra per month to try and live off of. And then it's 40 degrees and they can't afford to go anywhere. And they're going somewhere is outdoors where there's maybe water, but that doesn't cool your temperature. Like, you're still getting heat stroke. It's just you're not feeling it in the same way. And it's really heavy to see what's going on for me personally, because I used to be that kid where we used to go to the outdoor water center to try and cool off, and then we'd still be hot and uncomfortable, and we'd try and find a Subway or a McDonald's to kind of hide out in for a couple of hours to cool off. But then you see people misbehaving, making bad acts, and it increases during these periods. And it's heavy because part of it is absolutely their fault, but the other part is the temperatures, the situation that we're dealing with is challenging for so many people to think clearly and act rationally. And we know that I think it's like 13 or 14 degrees Celsius that you actually think at your best, that you've got like your prime, you're no distractions. When it's 35, you're not thinking clearly, you're more reactionary, you're more like wanting to give the person the middle finger when they cut you off in traffic because things aren't as clear in your mind as they should be. And so for me, there's a certain weight that these events have.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's really interesting what you were saying. I personally don't know, like, I haven't seen enough, interactions following a heat wave to be like, yeah, I totally agree that people act out when they're hot, but logically that makes sense, right?
It is a whole culture in the court system where we go, it's going to be a hot weekend, we're going to have a busy week in a couple of weeks when all of those charges end up in court. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So obviously that's something in your industry that you would have experience with and know, and that's something that's, I don't know, that's always interesting. Industries always have these little tidbits that kind of show off the world in a different way that you wouldn't expect. I wouldn't have expected that, but that does make sense. And I think in thinking in the Fraser Valley specifically, there's a big challenge. Well, thinking in society as a whole, there's a big challenge where there is not a lot of free places to go. There's not a lot of places that you can go and just exist. Specifically in places like during heat waves, there are not a lot of places you can go that are air conditioned where you can just exist. You have to spend money. And that's a problem. And then thinking in the rural Fraser Valley specifically, not only are there almost no places you can just exist for free in air conditioning, it is also extremely difficult to get to because there's lack of transit. So you have to drive your car, you have to walk. And sometimes you can't walk. Like, people in Harrison Mills Agassiz has the Friendship Center open for the heat wave right now because it's air conditioned. If you're in Harrison Mills, you're not going to walk to the Friendship Center. That's like, you have to walk over Mount Woodside. You're not doing that. But like, nor is there a reasonable bus service to get you there. Yeah. Right? So that's something that, like, as climate change gets more climate changey, that's something that communities are really going to have to think about is like, how are we going to, if we can't ensure that every home is air conditioned, or then how can we ensure that the majority of people have access to free air conditioning? And that's something that I think politicians and municipalities are still thinking about. I think the heat dome helped people understand that a little more because so many people died.
Yeah.
Right?
That's the heavy thing too, right? Is it's not just putting something in like a downtown Chilliwack where we know there's a community of people struggling with homelessness. We put in a cooling center. We're talking about seniors in either care homes or in apartments where they're trying to get by, but they're living paycheck to paycheck. They can't afford a $500, $600 air conditioner. And so it's not just one portion of society. It's affecting a broader scope of individuals than cold temperatures seem to.
Yeah. Well, and I think cold temperatures, like with cold temperature, if you're cold, you can put on a sweater, you can put on another sweater, and so on and so forth, until you are a ball of sweaters, but perhaps you are slightly warmer.
Yeah.
If you're too hot, you can't take off your skin, right? And yeah, there's only so much you can do to really cool down. You see a lot of people on social media sharing their tips and tricks for cooling down. And that's very important, obviously. But there needs to be some, in my opinion, there needs to be some structural changes. Because this is kind of going to be the way that it is, I think. And that is a little bit depressing, which is not what I said earlier was how I think I said earlier, I'm a little bit of an optimist, not necessarily for everything, a little bit of a pessimist in this regard. But like, yeah, so, and I think it's especially important in rural areas, which predominantly have older populations.
Yeah.
So District of Kent, Harrison Hot Springs, Hope, Fraser Valley Regional District. People are spread out. People don't necessarily have great transportation options, and judging by the latest census data, people aren't necessarily making a ton of money. Yeah. So,
and the value of their money is decreasing with inflation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, how are you going to help the most people? With your example, like obviously we're going to need something in downtown Chilliwack, right? There is a large population of people who are going to need a cooling center there. Yeah. But you also need to think about other spaces as well that are going to need it. And I don't have a good solution. I have not created the solutions journalism story for this yet.
Yeah. This is an area though that really interests, like, if I'm ever going to be described as extremely one way on something, it's that I want everybody to have equal opportunities to succeed. And
I think that's a reasonable request.
Yeah. And so when I think about how good the quality of sleeps I get because of the air conditioner in my room, the ability for me to focus and get tasks done when I'm in a temperature regulated space, the other one always for me is water. I really think that chlorine in the water is a bad thing. I've looked at the Government of Canada's website. They say small amounts over time causes cancer. That's what we have in our waters right now. So I'm big on Alkaline Planet, which is a local company. They sell filters. They filter out the chlorine water. I think it's like $20 to get a new filter for every 3 months. I'm big on wanting that in struggling communities because I used to have terrible acne until we got the shower head, which filters out the chlorine in the water, and we got rid of the chlorine in the water, and then my acne went away. I feel better. I used to feel like if I drank a lot of water, if I was doing a hike and I chugged that water, I'd feel like the water was like in my, like just sitting in my stomach.
Yeah, you could feel it there, yeah.
Yeah, like I had like a water baby or something, and it was like jugging around, where now I'd never feel that way. And so when I think about that, I want everyone to have those small tools that can help you reach greater success. Because I used to hate water because of the taste of it, and now I don't hate the taste of it. And so when I think of those things, it worries me because I don't want people to get more disadvantaged. And those small things, I think they add up over time. And that's one area where when I think about how hot and uncomfortable I was nearly my whole childhood, and we didn't have 45-degree days the way we have now, it really made me sad when I was downtown and saw all the kids playing outside and thinking, do they have like a cool place to go home to where they can cool off and breathe? Now, granted, most of them are going to be fine, but it's just a sense of like, I want them to have that fair opportunity, that fair chance to think clearly, to not make silly mistakes because they're so impacted by that heat.
Yeah. Well, and it's like basically you're describing Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Once your basic needs are met, then you can focus on becoming a better person and enhancing your community and working on bigger problems. So like, I don't think it's terribly radical to want everyone to have those basic needs met, to want everyone to be able to, live in an environment that is conducive to their well-being. That seems like what people deserve, right? Because, I think back to the heat dome, like my husband and I are super privileged in that we own our home and we have 2 portable air conditioners, and we were able to use one in our bedroom, one in our daughter's bedroom. And during this heat wave, it's going pretty well. Like you have to alternate so you don't get acclimatized to the air conditioner too much. You have to like go outside and then go in the house. And you're like, wow, the house is so cool. Yeah. And then you go into the air conditioning room and you're like, wow, the air conditioning room is so cool. And then you stay there and then you have to go back outside again to be like, no, this is the best it's going to get. But during the heat dome, we had those 2 air conditioners going, and we had, we played in the hose tons, just like constantly soaking cold showers all the time and stuff. But it was extremely stressful for me in our very, privileged household where we make good money and we have these air conditioners and stuff, where I was like waking up at 5 because it was hot and the air conditioner wasn't keeping up with the heat outside. And I was stressing about opening and closing the windows and the blinds and the timing of that. And was it cold enough outside for me to open the doors so that our house would cool down, and then having to remember to wake up at the right time so I could go close the doors again and close the windows again so the house wouldn't heat up as much. And it was still freakishly hot. Yeah. Right. And so, and we're very lucky. Yeah. And so, for me to be having those feelings and thinking about like a single parent who has to deal with that and work and stuff. And then elderly people doing that as well. It's like it occupies your whole mind. Yeah. So, I think that hopefully people in charge will be able to come up with some reasonable solutions to make it so that's not an experience for everyone, because we are going, the global temperature is rising. Even if we shut off all the fossil fuels right now, it's not going to reverse the trend necessarily, right?
Yeah, I think my frustration is more with industry, because I don't think, just like with gas prices, I've seen them coming from Vancouver to Chilliwack and seeing them nearly at par with each other, knowing that they're supposed to be.
That was super depressing. I had that same experience.
Yeah, there's supposed to be a difference because of our tax systems in Chilliwack. And there wasn't. And even Mayor Henry Braun was calling it out like, hey, this doesn't really make any financial sense. And again, industry is going to make decisions in their best interest. I just interviewed Joel Backen, who made the movie The Corporation and the New Corporation, describing how it's their whole job to act in their own best interest. It isn't. We do not set parameters that they're supposed to act in everybody's best interest. That would likely change how we define corporations. And so I do understand it from that perspective. The thing I don't love is that how are they always sold out? How are every week? We have a heat dome. This year, they should be like, we're going to need air conditioners. It's going to be a big thing. And they're sold out. And there's something about that if I'm a business person, I'm thinking we need maximum amount of air conditioners for everybody. And if we can sell even more, bring the price down, we can sell even more and make greater profits. And so there's something I would want to understand more about the business side of things, because I don't understand why there isn't an incentive to try and bring the costs down, sell more like you do with iPhones, and really get it out there. You're selling more, and it's becoming more of a cultural norm that's going to do better for your business over time than running out every few days and saying, we're just sold out of air. That doesn't make sense. And why does Best Buy still have them in stock? And it frustrates me.
No, that's fair. I think I have no answers for you.
Fair enough.
I think it is complicated, and but also I think as someone who's focused on local issues a lot, I think that is one of the issues with kind of the monopolistic tendency that we're seeing in capitalism as a whole. It's because like we're having a heat wave here. And in British Columbia, we don't have a culture of air conditioners the same way they do in Texas or other places that are hot all the time. Yeah. Right? So it's like, this is a big deal for us here on a national or a global scale. Probably not, it's probably not top of mind for the CEO of GM Electric, right?
Yeah.
And that's a challenge where, like local issues are very important to local people. And when you only have when you only have non-local individuals solving local problems, then you have a challenge.
Yeah. Can we talk a bit more about politics? We have a municipal election coming up. But I find local politics probably the most interesting because typically has the biggest effects, but you also get some of the greatest people. And like interviewing Mayor Henry Braun I felt very lucky that we did the interview post him deciding not to run, because I felt like I got a lot out of him that even he said, maybe I would have bit my tongue there, maybe I would have wandered around that question. And so it was great to get like an unfiltered, honest conversation about the state of affairs. But is it challenging to cover local elections as a journalist? Is there something you'd like to see done differently? I don't love how our debates are done now because the people asking the questions have a vested interest in having a great relationship with them afterwards. And so
you're thinking like the chamber sponsored debates and things like that, not specifically calling out the chamber, but
but where they have like a vested interest in not saying something that the person after the debate is going to go, I never want to talk to those people ever. I can't believe I was asked that. And like, not that you need to ask provocative questions, but tough questions need to be asked in those moments. And I just don't have 10,000% confidence that an organization that does need to work collaboratively afterwards is going to be able to ask all of those tough questions in every circumstance, where when you're a journalist, I hope that typically a politician goes, we're going to get some tough questions. They're journalists.
Yeah, I would hope the same thing, because like as a journalist, like if you're running for politics, anyone who is watching who is thinking of running for politics, you're gonna have to talk to journalists whether you like them or not. So buckle up, Buttercup. I've only ever covered one municipal election. I don't love it. I don't love politics. I like policy, but I don't love the optics of politics, if that makes sense. Like, I don't necessarily like people. I don't necessarily like covering the campaigns, I guess is a good way to put it. Just because you only get to find out if they've meant what they said after the fact.
Yeah.
And of course, I want to believe that they mean what they say. So we'll find out in October. But yeah, I think it's tricky. It's tricky to cover local politics because there's a lot of people running for quite a few positions in quite a few communities. And so our challenge at the Current is that we cover Langley City, Langley Township, Abbotsford Mission, Chilliwack, District of Kent, Harrison Hot Springs, Hope, FVRD. So that's like almost 10, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, well, and plus school boards. And so it's like, okay, well, how are we going to cover this in a way that is meaningful for people without wanting to die? And that is challenging, and we're still sort of trying to figure that out. We're going to have a plan by like September, because that's when the nomination lists come out, and that's when we need a plan. But yeah, it's challenging. And I feel for Adam at the Observer this year, because if you're at the Agassiz Harrison Observer, you cover Agassiz and you cover Harrison, and that's 2 municipal elections, and that's going to suck. But I think in general, it's easier to cover provincial and federal elections, even though they don't have as tangible an impact on small everyday things. Because you have parties, because you have, fewer candidates, fewer positions, typically better known names. And like more predictability, I think in general. If you follow politics, then you can kind of have a sense of where something's going to go. Not always, like, what we saw in Chilliwack in the provincial election. That was wild.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. I don't know about the municipal election, man. We're going to have to figure it out.
Yeah, it seems interesting because it is where the rubber hits the road for so many people. It does impact the community so vastly, and so many people don't know who their local representatives are, and it seems like that could be the difference that you're able to bring, is allowing people to understand on a deeper level why this matters in a way that right now most people have no idea who the mayor of Chilliwack is or the mayor of Abbotsford. Like the average person I've talked to, they have no idea. And it doesn't, it's nice that it doesn't worry them that much because things are running well and we've got roads and we've got lights and things are working. But
well, and that's the important thing, right? Is if your city is not literally falling apart, then
yeah.
and that's good. That's what you want.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I just don't know how feasible it is given the resources that are in journalism, not just in the Current, but like thinking about the Progress and the Abbotsford News and the Langley Advance Times. There are just so many candidates for quite a few positions. Like there's one mayor position, but you got councillor positions as well and stuff. And so much backstory to all of them. Like the Langley Township elections so far, we've got Blair Whitmarsh and Eric, what is his last name? Woodward. And a woman who's running, whose name I no longer remember just because Blair and Eric are already on council. I think her last name is Sparrow. I could be wrong. But it's like you have a lot of backstory with these people where Blair Whitmarsh is like, because Mayor Jack Rose isn't running again this year. He's been on council for a while. He's been a fairly, as far as I'm aware, a fairly uncontroversial mayor. And so Councillor Whitmarsh is like, I'm going to run for mayor. I'm going to follow basically what Jack was doing, and we're going to keep it homeostasis. And Eric Woodward is the opposite. He's been kind of the center of some Langley controversies for a while with the Eric Woodward Foundation. He owns much of Fort Langley. And if I'm not entirely mistaken, I think that's part of the reason why he ran for council in the first place, is because he maybe wasn't, and I can't remember exactly. So Eric, if you're watching, feel free to correct me later. But I think he wasn't entirely happy with some of the decisions that were happening in the Fort Langley area. So he ran for councillor, and now he's running for mayor on the idea that we need to make some changes and stuff. And so, you're going to have the same thing in the rest of the, in the 8 other communities as well. And they're going, and depending on the size of community, they're going to have varying importance on the rest of the Fraser Valley as well. So like the decision for mayor in Abbotsford, frankly, I don't even remember who's running for mayor in Abbotsford right now.
It was one of the councillors that Henry Braun mentioned is now going to run as councillor. I don't remember his name.
Oh, right. Yes, we did talk about that in one of our editorial meetings. So it's like the election in Abbotsford is maybe going to have a little bit more importance on the rest of the Fraser Valley because of Abbotsford's, importance as a center in the Fraser Valley and the decisions that they're going to have to make in regards to flood protection and things like that. But that doesn't mean that the election in Harrison Hot Springs is going to be any less important to the people in Harrison. Harrison Council, which I covered at the Observer, is notoriously, what's a good word? I don't have a good word. It's there's a lot of back and forth particularly between Leo Facio and John Allen, who have been two kind of common players in the Harrison political scene for decades, for many, many years. They both ran for mayor. They both ran for mayor for like the last 4 elections, and I think Leo's won the majority of them. And I actually don't know if both of them are running again. I don't think they've announced it yet. So we'll find out. But it's one of those things where it's like that's going to have very little impact on the Fraser Valley as a whole, but it's going to have quite a lot of impact on Harrison residents because it's a small community and it's also a resort municipality. So there could be some really big changes that come in the future, hypothetically, depending on who's in power, right? So, anyways, those are my municipal thoughts.
Yeah, I'm just curious, like, would you be able to do it based on like maybe issues of, or like, are you guys considering panel events for this? Because just my personal frustration is, again, I just feel like they're not always asked. I've attended different debates and it feels like they're always asked, like, what is your approach on housing? Mm-hmm. And it's very thoughtless. And I've played around with the idea of getting more involved and hearing more meaningfully from people who are running so that we can get a better understanding of who they are as a human being. And then hopefully that will give us some sort of inclination on where they would actually go on a decision when push comes to shove. If they have a history in their life of pushing and fighting and standing up for things, then I would bet that person's going to follow through. But if all we do is ask, like, how would you, like, Bud Mercer did a good job of just kind of making a joke, which was like Jeff Shields, who's an accountant, was asked about like what he would do like to address homelessness. And it's like, that is not the platform he was running on. It's not his expertise. And it's sort of unfruitful to ask him what his thoughts are on an issue he doesn't understand. And then I think Bud Mercer was asked about like transportation. And it's like, well, he's bringing his criminal justice background to this. So let's ask him about how he would address those issues and like, you can make an argument that it would be fruitful to understand how they would go on those issues. But if they don't understand the issue, no matter what their answer is, it's going to be sort of redundant because you don't know how they'll make the decision once they get given all the facts. And so I feel like it could be done in a better way. My hesitation is, I'm giving someone, perhaps, I don't like the term platform, but I'm giving someone the space to tell their story. And I try and stick it to people who are trying to do good. And politics is that space where they're acting in their own best interest. And they're going to tell me things that people want to hear. And there's not and I've had privately politicians say, I won't come on your podcast because I wouldn't be able to be my honest self. And I appreciate that, but it makes it more difficult for me to weed out the people running because they own land, because they're a real estate agent, and they're going to be able to influence decisions that are going to impact zoning, and that's going to help them in their business. And so it's like, it's tough for me to decide how to best approach asking questions or choosing who should come on. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's always going to be a challenge. And one of the things that councils do have to help that is that if you do have a conflict of interest, then you need to declare it and you need to step out, right? So that's something that's helpful after the fact, right? I know Chris Clute on Chilliwack Council, he has, quite a few family members who are doing quite a few developments or changes or rezoning applications. And so he's always stepping out of the council chambers. And so that's something that's helpful after the fact from that point. But I think just getting to know people before the election is going to be challenging for precisely those reasons that you said. And I'm also glad that you remembered your question after I went on my tangent. And as a journalist, I don't know if we have a really good way to fix that necessarily, because when you have 10 plus candidates in 9 communities, that's 90 people, right? So like, I can't sit down with 90 people and do a good in-depth interview with them in the time between the nominations are announced and election, right? So that's why you end up with these questions where you're asking an accountant about his opinion on homelessness or his opinion on housing affordability or things like that, because like, no, that's not his expertise, but you know what? As a counselor, that's something he's going to have to think about. So where are they right now? So like, no, it's not perfect. And I think that's something that organizations that have a smaller focus are going to be able to do a little better. Like the Chilliwack Progress is just going to be focusing on the Chilliwack election and the Chilliwack School Board election. So I hope for their sake that they're going to have more time to kind of dive into the individual people a little more. But I do think that's always going to be a challenge for municipal elections. And that's one thing that social media does help with a little bit, is that you can be like, okay, so, Ken's running again in Chilliwack. What do I know about Ken? You can go learn more about Ken. You could look on his Facebook page and be like, what does it say here? And you can kind of, for people who are technologically literate, that's an avenue that you have, and you should totally take it because it's just a huge volume of people that are running. And yeah, so I know for us, one of the things that we're thinking is to do kind of more of a questionnaire, but it will be, my guess is it will be reasonably generic across the board, because that's just the only way that it's a manageable amount of work. And that's one of the challenges of journalism, is sometimes you can't do everything that you want to do because you need to be like, well, will I sleep? Will I eat? Can I have a shower? and you just have to work with the parameters of what you're able to do.
Right. That makes sense. Where do you hope the Current goes through your time there? Are you looking out 5 years into the future? Do you have aspirations where your organization can go, the difference it can make?
Well, I mean, the difference it can make, obviously, like, you want it to keep growing and keep on meeting people's needs as far as local journalism, and keep on getting better and doing better journalism and being able to do more interesting stories and deeper dives and things like that. And that, being able to grow as a journalist in that structure is hopefully only going to help make it better. That's the hope, right? As far as like the company itself, because I'm not in an admin role, because I'm not in sort of a management role, I don't necessarily have a 5-year plan for the Current, because that's up to Tyler and Farhan and the rest of the team members who are kind of planning that. But obviously I'd like it to be around in 5 years. I'd like to have a job in 5 years,
What stories do you think over the past year do you think people should look back on, that they shouldn't let fade away into the back of their minds, where they should, like the Fraser Valley floods, of course, a good example of something where we're going to want updated stories, we're going to want to stay on the loop. Do you have any other examples of things people should try and go reread or stay up on that will help keep our communities informed?
Well, thinking about the election coming up, I did a story around the same time that I wrote this story on the Tajmi internment camp, where I went through, because the Chilliwack School Board was going through that special advisor and the investigation and things like that. So when we were waiting for the special advisor's report, I wrote a story on kind of the last decade of the Chilliwack School Board, centering on some of the controversies surrounding Barry Neufeld. Because that has been the focal point of the last decade of the Chilliwack School Board. Hard to believe it's been a decade, but it has. So I think if people want to get a sense of because Barry Neufeld has said he's running again. Daryl Ferguson has said he's running again. I believe Karen Bonder is running again, and Terry Westerby, who is new to the trustee world, is looking to run. But if people kind of want to educate themselves on some of the history of the school board before they vote in Chilliwack, I think that would be a good story to go revisit. And because this is another, it has another interactive tool from the JS Night Lab team of tools called Timeline. And so you can kind of like click through and see the timeline of the last decade. One person said it read like a soap opera, which it totally does. Because it's wild. But I think that's one thing that would be good for people to check up on, because it is going to be relevant in October again. And that's one way you can kind of educate yourself, is like looking at things that have happened in the past. And what other stories did we do that would be good?
Water?
Yes. We've done a lot of water stories. Sadly, I don't remember a lot of the stories.
You just did one, though, on running low on water quality, Chilliwack we're on an aquifer.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So I had 100% forgotten that I wrote that story, because I wrote it possibly before we had a website. So like right in the beginning, before the heat dome, I'm pretty sure. Can't remember exactly. Right. But yeah, so that was an interesting kind of look at the water system that we have here. And yeah, Chilliwack's on an aquifer, so it's like we're good. We have a lot of water, but it's like hard to tell how much water you have.
That's what blew my mind in the article, was we don't know that much about aquifers.
Oh, I know.
I say this a lot, but we as human beings, we drive our car with the lights and we feel like we've got stuff figured out. And then you say something like that, and when Paul Van Westendorp was talking about how honeybees dance in their hive to communicate with each other, and bumblebees don't know how to do that, it's just like, it wrinkles my brain, and then it makes me less confident that we've got everything figured out.
Well, that is the cool thing about the world, is that we will never know it all, which is like cool and also scary. Yeah. But yeah, like the aquifer thing, logically that makes sense. Like, we don't really know how deep an aquifer is. It's not really easy to tell how much water is in an aquifer. The water has to come from somewhere, and so are you able to judge where the water's coming from and stuff? So when I was writing, that totally blew my mind as well. But it's like, logically makes sense, right? Yeah, and there's lots of stuff like that. That's why it's fun being a journalist, because you get to figure it out and be like, oh, we don't know.
Do you have one story that stands out to you that taught you the most, or an area that you feel like you've grown the most in? Because that's something that I always try and remind people of, is like, it's important to stay like a learner. It's important to humble yourself to a topic and try to understand it a little bit more. Like, I'm watching the series How to Change Your Mind, and it's about like our relationship with psychedelics and LSD, and it's like, it's one where maybe I have a conservative tendency, because I think to change your mind or develop yourself, you should just do that through hard work and effort and overcoming adversity. And so it's interesting to learn how people have changed their values, become more open and understanding as a consequence of something like that. It's not something I love, but it's something that like I learn about and I go, wow, the world's so much more complicated than I realized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't have any particular... It would be hard to pinpoint one particular story where it's like, I learned the most from that. But I think there's definitely one of the things that I think you find in journalism is that stories always lead to more stories. So it's like, and that's one thing that we do a lot at the Current, is we have bonus stories. So we'll do a big story. And if you're watching closely, you'll notice this. You'll do a big story, and then a couple weeks later, we'll have a smaller story on a very similar topic. And that's our bonus story of like stuff that we learned that didn't quite make it into the big story. Or we'll have like the big story and then an excerpt of an interview and stuff. So I think like personally as a journalist, one area where I feel like I've grown a lot is in my reporting on Indigenous issues and Indigenous coverage. And I'm like super grateful for all the sources that have like helped me get better at that, because it's really important, especially in the Fraser Valley, where we have such a large Indigenous community and history that is like so undertold. In a sense, and I'm looking over there and I'm seeing all your books and like some of them that I want, and like the Stolo Coast Salish Historical Atlas is so good.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that I was introduced to that so I could buy it, so I could learn from it, right? And so that's one thing that I feel like I have learned a lot about. And obviously still tons more to learn, but it's really nice to get past the point of feeling like you know nothing, and then feeling like you know lots, and then feeling like you know nothing again. Yeah. It's always good to get to that like last feeling like you know nothing section, because that means you're kind of on a good learning path, because there's always more that you'll get to know about. And in a weird way, like the dairy industry is also kind of like that for me, because I've done a surprising amount of reporting on dairy cows.
Not surprising when you think you live in the Fraser Valley.
Yeah, surprising and not surprising. I guess surprising in that it's not commonly covered.
Yeah.
Because it's like super industry specific. But yeah, it's like I have more story ideas for dairy related stories that I'd like to tackle someday that I haven't gotten a chance to yet. Like I'd love to, because dairy cows are typically like Holsteins. Dairy farms are full of females, right? Because that's where dairy comes from. So it's like, where are all the dudes? And because I went to a Dairy Industry Awards ceremony once, and they had door prizes, and some of the door prizes was like 10 units of semen, like 5 units of semen. And it's like, that is a good prize for a dairy farmer, because you got to impregnate your cows so that they'll produce milk, right? Yeah. So it's like, so how are they getting these units of semen? Who is the top producing bull in the Fraser Valley? It's like, that's such a weird story, but it'd be so fun to do. Yeah. So that's on my list for someday.
I feel that way. I feel like talking about bees was when I started the podcast not on the radar, and talking to Chris Koo about birds wasn't on my kind of like, this is where I'm going to take this. And it's really important to me to go in different directions and really get curious about it. And I have like a whole logic why I don't send the questions out months in advance, because then I'm excited about it when the person's coming on in a few days, and that genuine curiosity comes through, where if I write it a month in advance, I'm kind of like, oh yeah, I was going to ask about that. And maybe there's not that like inspiration behind it. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's what gets other people interested in a topic, is if you're interested, they'll come along for the journey. But if it's a monotone kind of process where you're just checking a box, you lose that. And those quirky topics have been some of the most successful, made other people more like curious about where they live, and connecting with the farms and the culture and the hard work people put in to have grocery stores filled with food. It's like, you don't always realize that you can, like, we only buy our eggs locally now from places who've built a whole egg stand, because they're working every day to get that running. And it's like, it's so cool. And then the other weird thing is they're not as impacted by inflation as quickly as your grocery store is going to be, because there's a whole process to get it into, and everybody in that kind of market line has to get paid. And so prices go up faster there than they do if you go to your egg producer, or if you buy milk local, like whatever it is.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So can you tell people how they can connect with you on Twitter, on how they can connect to the newsletter, and maybe why they should?
Don't connect with me on Twitter. You can. It's fine. I don't post very much. Yeah, so Twitter is definitely my professional social media. So it's at Grace Ken, 2 N's, because I'm Grace Kennedy, spelt like the president. And yeah, and then the Current, go to fvcurrent.com, and then you can subscribe there, and you'll get to learn all about me and Tyler and Jyoti and our cool stuff. But Because it's cool to learn. And that's why you should do it.
And it's much more committed to community. It's much more digestible. If you find yourself scrolling through Facebook trying to find out what the latest stories are, it's not good for you. It's not good for your mental health. It's not good for your overall well-being. I think that the Fraser Valley Current does a great job of telling you what you need to know, keeping you in the loop, getting you excited about your community. So I highly recommend you go follow Grace, Tyler, Jyoti on Twitter to stay up to date, but also go subscribe to the newsletter and stay in the loop about your community. So Grace, I really appreciate you being willing to make the trek. I know it's getting very hot in here, so I appreciate you enduring that as well. I've learned a lot through this, and I think what you guys are doing, the personability of it, if that's a word, means a lot to me. I'm always excited to share you guys' work and let people know, because I really believe it's the next path forward for journalism and for reconnecting our communities after the events that we've been through.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Aaron, and for being a better spokesman for the Current than I have been so far.
No problem. You're the one doing the work to get the stories out. It's one of my challenges is getting the word out on social media, because by the time I've put in all the work into all of the development of a podcast, it's like I'm done now. And so getting the excitement out it can be the hardest part. So I just appreciate all the work you guys are doing. I think we're really lucky that you've all dedicated yourself to that. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. And that's the same challenge that we have at the Current too, is because you spend so long on a story and then you're like, oh, it's done. Oh, wait, now I need to tell people that we've done it.
Well, I will be always happy to get the word out. What I hope to do in the future is to have you guys on to kind of recap what's been going on over the past 4 months or whatever it is, so that for people who didn't tune into that story, now they're a little bit more caught up in the loop and we can get kind of some of the behind the scenes of what you guys learned. So
that would be sweet. Yeah. And thanks so much, Aaron.